It was a crime that would stun the nation.
It's now 9 days since 2 teenage girls disappeared from southern New South Wales.
In my 37 years in the police force, this was probably the cruelest and most tragic murder I've had to deal with.
The disappearance of 2 schoolgirls would devastate their friends and family.
I was 17 years old when I found out, and it rocked my world.
Are you able to tell me which of the 2 girls that was?
The one with the blonde hair.
The fate of Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry, and the appalling manner of their deaths, would confound the press and public alike.
Over the next 9.5 hours, Lauren and Nicole were repeatedly raped by both men at various points.
I said, you know, how did they die? She said, oh, throats cut. I said, who killed them? I killed both.
The case of the Bega Schoolgirls was a crime that shook Australia. This untamed forest near the Cupra-Canberra National Park was the site of one of the most tragic, senseless crimes ever to occur in Australia. In October 1997, 2 young friends, 14-year-old Lauren Barry and 16-year-old Nicole Collins, were taken to the forest and brutally murdered. The events that led the 2 girls to that wild and remote location began on the 5th of October 1997. It was a beautiful afternoon on the Sapphire Coast in New South Wales, and a group of teenagers were camping just a few kilometres from home.
Tathra is a sleepy, tiny coastal village. The area that the girls were staying was down a dirt track. It's the type of place where you think that your kids could grow up, they could have the idyllic lifestyle.
On the day that Nicole and Lauren disappeared, we were camping in our camp spot that we would go to regularly with our horses. We'd been there for, I think, 2 days. We were just camping, doing the usual teenager thing. We had a fire, we were eating, listening to music.
These were teenagers. They were camping in a spot that was within minutes drive of one of the parents. They were camping in a big group, there were horses. They were doing all the sorts of things teenagers should be doing, and it should have been safe.
Also at the campsite that day was Lauren's older brother, Nathan.
My sister, she was in a really tight-knit group of friends. They were into the horses and horse riding, and tried to avoid me and my mates as much as possible, harassing them, as young boys do. She was my best friend, and she was very strong. She had to be, because I was always picking on her and blaming her for everything.
Nicole had actually recently broken up with her boyfriend, and she wanted to go and see him and see if they could, reconcile their relationship.
Sarah and I both had our boyfriends there, and they didn't, and they were feeling quite excluded, I think. They were talking about wanting to leave and go to our friend Michael's place, because that's where Nicole's ex-boyfriend was. So Nathan had come out to visit us that day. He'd driven out, he was older, he had his own car, he had a licence, and then he was leaving. And as he was getting into the car, I thought, quick, get up now, tell him that girls want to go with him. If you don't, you're going to regret it. But I was like, My logic brain ruled that out, like, that's stupid. What are you going to regret? Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? The urge was so strong in me to get up and tell him, wait, stop, the girls are going with you. A few hours later, it was dark and the girls decided that they really did want to go to the party and they were going to walk there. They had a torch, they had a bottle of Coke with some Jim Beam in it because we were classy. And they set off walking. I never thought that they would ever actually get there because it's a really long walk. So I thought they'll probably get to Nicole's house, which was the closest house, and go, too hard, and just sleep there.
So the last thing that I said to the girls before they left the campsite was, where are you going? Which Nicole said, I'm going to fix up my life, which obviously now, looking back, is ironic because she never got the chance.
The two young girls set off through the forest. It would be the last time that their friends would ever see them alive. Not long after they left, Lauren's brother Nathan arrived back at the campsite. When he got there, he discovered that Lauren and Nicole were gone.
Nathan missed the girls by only a matter of minutes when he came back that night. As he was driving in, he must have, they must have been so close.
I think it was around 10:10 at night. I was driving back to the campsite. Throughout my life, I've blamed myself a lot for not being there a little bit earlier, or not staying at the campsite and with, supporting them. It's pretty hard to take that I was only 10 minutes out from perhaps picking them up myself.
And it wasn't until the next morning that we realised that there was something wrong.
On the night of the 5th of October 1997, two schoolgirls, Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry, left their friends at a local campsite and headed off through the bushland towards a party a few kilometres away. It would be the last time their loved ones would see them alive.
Nicole was very outgoing and very social and gregarious, and she would just go and make friends. She always wanted to be with people and doing things and going out and having fun.
I first met Nicole when I moved to Bega from Canberra. I was in year 7 and I'd just come from a school where I was actually bullied. So I was very vulnerable and didn't have any friends, didn't know anybody, and I was just sitting at school, by myself, and Nicole came up to me and said, I love your shirt. I was like, oh, okay, thank you. And from that moment on, just instantly like that, we were friends.
Lauren was much more shy. She was a lot like me. We were both introverts. We bonded, and I don't think I've ever had a friend like her that we just understood each other at some level. It was just a connection that we had, and everything that we did was funny. We were hilarious. We cracked each other up, and she was such a great girl.
The morning after the girls vanished, their friends and family began to realise something was terribly wrong.
My parents asked me where Lauren was, and I said, isn't she here? Hasn't she come home? They headed this way in the evening. It was just over a kilometre from the campground, so I assumed that she would be there. So at that point it was like, okay, she's not here. Something's not right, I guess. Maybe she's at Nicole's place. So I think my parents would have rung Nicole's parents to find out if the girls were there, and obviously they weren't.
I remember her parents arriving in the car and asking us, through the window, have you seen the girls? To which we replied no. They then said the girls are missing. So we immediately assumed, oh, they're just at somebody's house. We'll have to go and check everyone's house. To which we were told that had already happened, and they'd called up a few different places and a few friends, and they were nowhere.
We assumed that they might have gotten lost walking home, but when you assume something like that, knowing them so well, it was just a hope that that's all it was.
Before I knew it, basically, there was police, SES, VRA, everyone was up at our campsite within such a short amount of time.
We began searching all the coastline, all the bush, all the common places that the girls would hang out or go to. Popular places that they may have been, and no prevail. Yeah, there was no sign of them.
It's now 9 days since 2 teenage girls disappeared from southern New South Wales. Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins have seemingly disappeared from a camping trip without a trace.
It's a pain that can't be described, I don't think. A total loss, emptiness. You can't get warm, you're just cold all the time because it's just a pain that is totally undescribable. Until you've been through it, you have no idea what it's like.
At this stage, we've got 2 avenues of inquiry. One is that the 2 girls have left the area voluntarily, and secondly, that they've been forcibly taken from the area.
Going through a lot of heartache. Just don't want it back. I don't care what I have to do to get it back.
After 3 weeks of desperate searching, the only sign of the 2 girls was a surf jacket with a checked pattern found by a dirt track at the local rubbish tip. The jacket belonged to Lauren Barry, but initial forensic examinations provided no clues, and with little else to go on, police made the extremely difficult decision to wind down the search.
I think I went back to Sydney after 2 weeks. I was told there's nothing that could be done and I need to try and get back to work and do things. I was 17. I just did what I was told and went back to my beautiful friends and family in Sydney that looked after me over that period. And I think the police at that point, after 2.5 weeks, started to wind down the search in the area and started to change into more of a detective sort of trying to look into evidence and find out where they may have ended up.
Mark Winterflood was one of the detectives left in the area, tasked with finding any clues that might help determine the whereabouts of the 2 girls.
There was a number of lines of inquiry, 8 or 9 of them, and we had them all listed on a whiteboard in the meeting room. And right at the end, when people were going home, a officer from Yass, a detective from Yass, had rung through and said these 2 men, Camilleri and Beckett, are quite capable of abduction or kidnapping.
Camilleri and Beckett were a 2-man crime wave. Camilleri was a standover man and Beckett was his lapdog. Beckett was known to sometimes sleep on the veranda out the front of Camilleri's house, waiting for him to tell him what to do. So Camilleri would send him outside and Beckett would go and sleep and wait for him there.
My first impression of Lindsay Beckett was that he was a quieter individual, easily led. He was a criminal who had 50 plus prior entries and very much out of control in the little town of Yass where they lived.
Beckett's mother had him when she was 15. He never knew his natural father. He was the child of a rape. He grew up in a really violent household. He was renowned for bar fights that he was involved in. Leslie Alfred Camilleri was a career criminal who was born in 1969 in Liverpool, Sydney. He had 146 convictions.
Both Camilleri and Beckett are heavy speed users. For people who are not familiar with speed, it's a drug which keeps you wide awake. And these guys could go 3 or 4 days without sleep, have 2 hours sleep and do it all again. That's the nature of the drug.
These 2 career criminals began to fall under the spotlight in connection with the disappearance of Lauren and Nicole. Having ruled out other suspects, police decided to pursue the lead, and it proved to be a wise move.
When the original team was sent home, there was this one line of inquiry left to look at Camilleri and Beckett. We then received further information from Yass that they had met with an informant, and all the information was that he'd had a conversation in a room with Camilleri and Beckett, that it was in the newspaper, and Camilleri had said words to the effect, "I bet the cops try to pin this on us." And we thought, that's a strange thing to say if you had no involvement whatsoever. So we raced up there and we decided we would interview Mr. Beckett. It was on that trip to Canberra that I was with another officer, Detective Stuart Gray, and in the early stage of the investigation, he had taken a statement from a fellow who had noticed on the hill at Evans Hill the next morning a large television set beside the road which was a light pink in colour. And then another person had also noticed it, who'd been surfing that morning, but later in the morning it had disappeared and no one could understand why. While we're on this trip to Canberra to speak to Mr. Beckett, Stuart Gray had said to me, you know, it would make sense if you're putting two girls in the car, you'd leave the TV out because it's just physically not space. And I really didn't think there was much in that at the time, but we sort of kept it up our sleeve.
Seated opposite us on the other side of the table is Mr. Lindsay Beckett. Lindsay, do you agree that apart from the three people I've described, there's no one else in the room?
That's correct.
And do you agree, just looking at the monitor there, it's 11:58 and a number of seconds?
Yes.
Okay.
We met Mr. Beckett and had quite a long conversation with him. He was the most relaxed person I've ever met. He actually had his feet up on the chair in the interview room as if he just didn't care. I held back the question about the television till quite near the end, and you could sense there was a change in his demeanour. He was obviously a bit uncomfortable when that came up and didn't have a good answer.
Can you recall the television being in the back seat at all at that time?
I don't know.
Can you recall getting rid of
those bags and stuff like that?
Can you recall getting rid of the television at any time during that trip?
No.
Convinced the television may be the clue that could unlock the case, police discovered that Camilleri and Beckett had actually been given a TV as part payment for a drugs deal. They now needed to establish if that TV was the one found on the side of the road.
We went to the second-hand store and the guy he remembered it, he pulled out all his records and went through them. And he said, here it is, here's the brand, here's the serial number, and we got the lot. I said, wow. And so I said to him, can you remember what colour it was? He says, oh, I just think it was a wood grain TV. It wasn't anything special. It was quite an old one. So that really didn't fit. So we left there and we got out of Yass heading back to Bega, probably a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. And for some reason, I'd given the dealer my business card with the mobile number. I got this mobile call from him apologising to say, listen, I forgot something which I think is really important. He said, that TV was pink. So, whoa, we stopped the car. Well, that's it. It's got to be it.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins had discovered a vital clue in the hunt for the missing schoolgirls. A pink television found by the side of a road where the girls were last seen placed Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett in the area. An interview with Beckett confirmed the police's suspicions. 4 weeks after the girls went missing, police now needed to get Camilleri's version of events. And, as luck would have it, he was already in the hands of the law. In custody for a breach of bail, Camilleri was interviewed by detectives. They applied the same technique they had used with Beckett, keeping their information about the TV to themselves until the right moment.
During the interview, Camilleri started to spin a very vague story about where they'd been and what they'd done. And then at the penultimate moment, he asked him about, and did you have a pink TV in the car? Well, Camilleri just went absolutely silent, and it was like a minute silent. He just didn't know what to do and then said, I'm not talking to you any further. After the interview, Camilleri had gone back to his cell and was banging his head against the wall crying, saying they know about the television, and had to be sedated. And it's the first time I've ever had a prison psychologist contact police to say, I think this is significant evidence that you should know.
Detectives sensed that Beckett was the weaker of the pair and their best chance to crack the case. They were right.
We got Beckett out of custody at a police centre in Canberra, got him to an interview room, and before going to the room, I'd actually obtained 2 large photos of the 2 girls. And before I even said anything, I just pulled them out of my folder and placed them right in front of him. They were big A4 pictures. And he just saw the look in his eyes and he turned them over straight away. I thought, all right, we're on. So I quietly went through the story with him that I knew, that I could show where he was, that they were involved, and that Camilleri was no longer loyal to him, and that today he had an opportunity to show us what had happened. And I said, Camilleri's going to be made this offer later today. He may choose to take us there, he may not.
At one point, Beckett left the room for a cigarette. As they discussed the progress of the interview, the key question the detectives faced was whether they'd done enough to turn their suspect. Moments later, they had their answer.
I'd barely finished speaking and Beckett came at a fast pace down the corridor, straight into the room, and said, I'll show you where they are. We unfolded a large map we had with us, and you could see him following the Monara Highway. And he went sort of across the border, past Bombala, and said, I think they're about here. And I said, you know, how did they die? And she said, oh, throats cut. I said, who killed them? I killed both.
Beckett proceeded to give a full statement, and before long, he was taking detectives on a sinister road trip, pointing out where knives had been dumped and bloodied clothing had been burnt. Hours later, the group arrived at Fiddler's Green Creek, an isolated area of forest just over the border into Victoria. They were almost 200 kilometres from where the girls were last seen.
So we're traipsing down through quite thick bush. And as we descend into this creek, you can smell putrefying flesh. We knew we were on the right track. And we pretty well came out near this massive tree with the roots hanging out, and you could see Lauren's skeleton straight away.
This is a electronically recorded interview between Detective Sergeant Mark Winterflood and Lindsay Beckett. Just across the creek and slightly upstream, we came to an area where there's a large tree fallen across the river.
Yep.
And beneath the root section of that tree in a portion of water was what appeared to be the remains of a deceased person.
Yes.
All right.
Then I asked him, where do we find the other girl?
Only a few metres away, police discovered the remains of Nicole Collins.
You led us to an area there which we searched, and we later found what appears to be the remains of another deceased body next to a small tree.
Yep.
Okay, and you indicated that to us?
Yep.
Okay. And are you able to tell me which of the 2 girls that was?
The one with the blonde hair.
And spectacles?
Yeah.
Right. At the time that she died, was she wearing spectacles?
No, she didn't have them on.
All right. Do you know what happened to them?
They should have been there.
They're somewhere near there?
Yeah.
I was 17 years old when I found out, and yeah, it rocked my world. It just destroyed every little bit of security or love and knowledge I knew of the world had just been shattered. I didn't know that this sort of stuff could happen, or that there were people in the world that could do this sort of harm to others.
With Beckett's statement, the police could finally piece together what had happened to the 2 girls and how their young lives had been tragically cut short.
So they disappeared from the campfire and they walked down a dirt track. Lauren had a black torch and Nicole was carrying some alcohol. They wandered towards the road, and sometime around the time the dirt road met the main road, a car drove past with Camilleri and Beckett in it.
They actually stop in the roadway. I think the girls might have been slightly on the roadway too, and are blocking access of other cars around them. And then as they get talking to the girls, they move the car off. And it was never really clear to me whether they were forced into the car or whether there was some duress involved. I suspect there was some duress involved, but for whatever reason, both girls get in the car.
If you were to ask anyone that knew these girls, they were very young girls. I still believe to this day, it doesn't matter what was said or what people may believe have happened, or you hear stories of people hitchhiking and getting into cars or being influenced to do things. They were very young. And if you ask anyone that knew them, they were very innocent. And for fear of their lives, I think is the only way they may have been coerced into the vehicle.
The mistake the two men make is that the car is full of stuff. So while they're talking to the girls and trying to induce them into the car, they take this television out and put it beside the road and move clothing and other stuff into the boot. So the girls then get into this car. What they don't realise is that both doors were inoperable. And so once they were in, they were locked in.
According to Beckett's version of events, after spending some time driving around looking for a beach party, the pair asked if the girls wanted to go with them to a festival in Bega. The girls supposedly agreed, on the condition that they could tell their friends where they were.
The girls wanted to go back to their campsite. They drive along the dirt road towards White Rock, which has these sort of speed humps to stop cars going in. Camilleri's car scrapes. He flies off the handle. They both produce knives, and from that point on, the girls are kidnapped. They come out of that road, go back onto the Snowy Mountains Highway, and then travel back onto into Callaroo itself, and then they turn left down a dirt road which leads towards Bega Tip and south towards Merimbula. Now, it's my understanding that whilst on that road, they've stopped and removed both girls from the car, and they've both forcibly had sexual intercourse with each of the girls at knife point. What's interesting from that scene, and it's never completely clear to me, was that there were two items of clothing belonging to Lauren Barry that were left beside the road. Now, whether that was the actual scene of the sexual assault or whether that was Lauren throwing it out the window as a indicator that we've gone south, I really don't know. But nevertheless, when they were reported as missing, that was the first thing that was found, was a shirt and a jacket belonging to Lauren Barry.
Over the next 9.5 hours, Lauren and Nicole were repeatedly raped by both men at various points.
As dawn broke on the 6th of October, and following a night of the most appalling brutality, the car containing Lauren and Nicole arrived at Fiddler's Green Creek.
We tied the girls up, tied their hands up, and they went down to the river.
For the sake of the record, I'm showing Mr. Beckett 2 colour photographs of Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry.
It was her jeans.
Right.
Yeah.
Which you wrapped around their mouths?
Yeah.
Right. Did you tear them up or cut them up or something?
Les teared them off.
Right.
Both girls were then walked along a track and towards a creek bed.
Lauren Barry was tied on the ground there and fully tied, hands, feet and hog-tied behind her back. And then Beckett took Nicole Collins up a sort of a steep embankment that's about, I suppose, 10 metres away. And up the top, he tied her with her hands behind the back at a tree and her feet were tied. Camilleri leaves, instructing Beckett how to kill them. Drown this one and stab that one. Camilleri goes back to his car.
One was restrained on the ground, one was hands tied behind the back, to the tree?
To the tree, yeah.
Okay. And to your knowledge, Les got to the car before anything happened, is that right?
Yes.
Right. And he'd given you instructions of what he wanted done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Beckett then drags Lauren into the creek, which is quite shallow, but at this little corner where they were, there was a very large tree that had fallen in the water with its roots exposed, and there was quite a deep sort of hollow right there. So he's dragged her in there, and she's kicked and struggled and sprayed him with water.
He began to drown Lauren, who fought for her life, and stabbed her to ensure that she was dead until she stopped moving, while Nicole watched from the tree.
Then he's left there and gone up this embankment. He comes up behind Nicole, stabs her in the throat, and then she dies.
He then walked back to the car. Camilleri had returned to the car by that stage, and Camilleri asked him, "Did you see the demon? Did you feel the demon?" They got in the car. Beckett slept until they reached Canberra, where Camilleri instructed him on how to burn the ropes and the bloodied clothing, and then they went and threw the knives into Lake Burley Griffin and then went home.
With Beckett admitting his role in the murders of Lauren and Nicole, police now had to find out what part Camilleri had played in ending the girls' lives.
After the interview with Beckett, Detective Sergeant Meagher, instead of coming to the scene, had gone to Goulburn Jail to take on the interview with Camilleri. During that interview, Camilleri put forward a version of events that he had been in the car. Yes, some girls had got in, he'd fallen asleep, had no real recollection. Beckett came back to the car with blood on, etc., etc., distancing himself from anything to do with the murders.
Despite the denials, Beckett's statement was enough for police, and both men were charged with murder. But now, detectives faced another challenge: how to prove Camilleri was responsible when he wasn't even present for the killings. In August 1998, two men stood charged with the brutal murder of two young girls, Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins, who'd been abducted whilst on a camping trip with friends the previous October. The accused, Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett, had been arrested after a police operation, and Beckett was quick to confess. Camilleri, on the other hand, refused to accept any part in the crimes.
When Beckett and Camilleri came before the courts in Victoria, Beckett entered a plea of guilty, and he was dealt with before the trial of Camilleri. And I remember at the sentencing, the judge reading Nicole's death, which was horrific. And then he sort of looked at Beckett and his barrister and said, "Your client did that?" and just sort of shook his head.
Justice Vincent didn't think he'd ever heard a more terrible or moving description of a death of a person. He said Beckett was nothing more than a quite willing participant, and there was never any suggestion the girls were going to be released.
Beckett was given a 35-year minimum term, and that was also on the proviso, his agreement to give evidence against Camilleri.
Lindsay Beckett's testimony was crucial towards securing a conviction against Leslie Camilleri. It was clear that both men had taken drugs during the trip. In his defence, Camilleri's lawyer said that Camilleri had been taking heroin, that he'd either been half asleep or asleep during most of the trip, and that he had not been involved in the murders at all.
The difficulty with Camilleri's case was that he physically was not present at the murder. So the onus was on the prosecution to demonstrate the level of control that he had over Beckett, and that Beckett was acting at his behest in killing the girls. And from a legal position, that's quite a tough call.
Luckily, the prosecution could call on science to help them in the case against Camilleri. Detectives had collected the clothing belonging to Lauren Barry, found at the side of the dirt track, and sent it for analysis.
They found a tiny trace of Camilleri semen on Lauren's jacket, which absolutely sealed his involvement in the sexual assaults and gave corroboration to Beckett's version of events.
Another chilling piece of evidence that further strengthened the case against Camilleri was found in police files.
2 weeks prior to the murder of the girls, there'd been an incident in Canberra where Camilleri and Beckett had picked up a girl who was also a speed user, and they'd all used speed together. They then went on to have her in the back seat of the same car with the doors that you couldn't open. She was then sexually assaulted at knife point and taken along various dirt roads out of Canberra. And at one point, she was quite desperate and said, "I need to go to the toilet," which was a bit of a ploy. And when they opened the door for her, she ran, and she ran and ran and ran to a wombat burrow where she hid herself. And they were searching through the bush with their knives trying to find her. She then goes to a farmhouse, makes the complaint. Police arrive, arrange for her to be forensically examined and to make a statement.
The victim of that ordeal ultimately chose not to give the police a statement, and she disappeared. Her case was shelved. That was until the Bega detectives managed to track her down and convinced her to speak to them.
Within a week, they had actually found her and committed her to a statement which read like a live enactment of what must have happened to the 2 girls.
She established their way of operating. So they had picked her up from the street. They, on her account, had sexually assaulted her. So it seemed to show that they at least had a way of operating that seemed quite similar to the way they operated in the case of the Bega Schoolgirls.
Her evidence of surviving the sexual assaults and running away at knife point, in New South Wales we call it tendency evidence. In other words, the person has a propensity to do that sort of violence. So demonstrating that in Camilleri's case was compelling.
For the friends and relatives of Lauren and Nicole, the trial represented another terrible ordeal that they had to face.
I remember my father holding me back, and also a security guard behind us holding me back, and just listening to the story and someone reading out what he had done to my sister and Nicole. Every word was like a dagger in your body, and I was sort of feeling everything she went through, both the girls went through, and trying to fathom and understand what it must have been like. It just tears open the wounds even more. They hadn't even had a chance to heal.
As I stood in the witness stand, I do remember Leslie Camilleri was staring at me, and it was a horrible, horrible feeling knowing that this monster who killed my friends was metres away from me and staring at me. I do remember he would be, purposely putting his hands up and yawning so everyone in the court could see him. He had no remorse for what he'd done and for anyone else in the room.
In April 1999, after a trial lasting almost 2 months and involving over 70 witnesses, Leslie Camilleri was found guilty of the murders of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins.
When Camilleri was found guilty, in his judgment, Judge Vincent said, "You will represent the dark in which women and children fearfully walk. Through your own acts, you have forfeited your right to ever walk among us again." It was at that point we realised he was going to be given the life sentence.
For the murders of Lauren and Nicole, Leslie Camilleri was sentenced to life in prison and with no possibility of parole. He will die behind bars. In 2013, he was sentenced to another 28 years after admitting to the murder of teenager Prue Bird. That was in 1992, 5 years before Lauren and Nicole went missing. For his part in the Bega Schoolgirl murders, Lindsay Beckett was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 35 years.
Considering what they had done to other human beings, there has to be more to I knew what capital punishment was, and I thought, well, why can't we kill these people? Get rid of them, eradicate them. We do that with animals. We're animals. If someone has done this, why can't we get rid of them? But then at the same time, there's so much love and compassion inside me. I didn't want that either. I didn't want to be like them, and I didn't know whether they deserved more or less, or what was going to happen to them in jail.
What compounds the anguish for the victims' families is the truly unbelievable timing of the crime. That the girls emerged onto the highway precisely as two of the most dangerous men imaginable were driving past. Perhaps if they'd been just 30 seconds later, they might just have continued walking. They might have gone on to live out their lives.
In my 37 years in the police force, this was probably the cruelest and most tragic murder I've had to deal with. Most of the detectives involved would have been on previous murder investigations, but what I think separated this one was that the intense cruelty of their final hours of the two girls, that they should suffer such horrific sexual experiences and then be killed so brutally. Most of us on the team had daughters, and so you empathise with parents as to how, I don't know how they could ever move on from it. I don't think you could possibly.
What I'd say to them, if I ever saw them again, is that I'm really sorry. And that's the hardest thing for me, is the guilt. Living with the guilt. That we couldn't save them. That they were in that car for so long, waiting for someone to save them. I didn't save them. Living with the guilt of that, feeling that I let them down, and it was a betrayal of sorts, that they were my friends and I couldn't help them when they needed help the most.
I find it really hard to focus on anything, even day-to-day tasks, getting out of bed and caring for my lovely family, my two young boys, because I feel very broken inside.
They will live in my heart forever. I will absolutely never forget them. Not a day goes by where I still don't think about them.
In March 2017, Nathan Barry offered to take Sarah to Fiddler's Green Creek. It was the first time she had visited the place where her friends had died.
So if you want to follow me down here, and I'll take you down to the site. Although it's what we all know, the beautiful Australian bush with all the smells and sounds and the peace and harmony of it all, it would be pretty quickly taken away if you were a young girl being forced against your will to trudge through this steep and rugged terrain, not knowing where you're going and knowing that you're being taken further and further away from the ones you love and who you knew were probably searching for you.
It's just blown me away at how dense it is, how hard it is to get here. It's not what I had in my mind. It's really given me just sort of the last puzzle piece, you know. I've seen it and I've been here now, so.
The legacy of this case will be, we need to stop victim blaming, because it's never, ever, ever the victim's fault. And that happened a lot when the girls went missing. Oh, they shouldn't have been walking along the road, they shouldn't have been hitchhiking, they shouldn't have been drinking, they shouldn't have done this, they shouldn't have done that. Well, actually get stuffed, because it's taking blame off the perpetrators and putting it on the victims. And it's making women feel like you have to be afraid all the time and you have to be careful all the time and you always have to think about what you're doing and where you're going and who's going to be with you. But we're not putting that onto the perpetrators of the crime. Like, you have to not commit crimes. You have to, when you feel the urge to rape someone, you have to stop that. And, you know, so I hope that the legacy of this will be, it's always the perpetrator's fault and never, ever the victim's fault.
I guess my message or anything I could say to everyone that's perhaps listening to this in the world, and however they're receiving it, from whatever background or race or belief or philosophy they have, is that I think we need to create more community within society, stop being so judgmental and selfish, and have gratitude for what we have. And the biggest thing is we have each other. We're all human beings and we need to turn around and hug each other a lot more regularly. That's the biggest thing. We're not hugging. We need to hug. I'm all about that. And I think there is hope for humanity, but it's a really hard thing to say when coming from what I've been through and what I continue to suffer every day.
Just after 4 p.m. one December afternoon in 1987, a Melbourne office block became a scene of carnage.
In all my years of policing and as a detective, this is absolutely the worst crime scene I ever saw.
Relatives of the victims had to be restrained by police as they raced to the scene.
Innocent office workers found themselves caught up in a terrifying ordeal as they witnessed friends and colleagues being killed in front of them.
I never believed you could smell fear. He absolutely stank.
He just walked over and held the gun barrel about an inch away from Michael's scalp and shot him again.
The man at the centre of the chaos was a young student whose pent-up anger and frustration would lead to a tragic outcome.
He was a volcano waiting to erupt. He was a time bomb waiting to go off, and it went off on December the 8th, 1987.
Just come into the building with a dead man, looks like on the footpath, and I'm not quite sure. It's right in front of me, please.
The cold-blooded massacre that took place in Queen Street in central Melbourne was a crime that shook Australia.
Queen Street's predominantly one of the busiest streets of Melbourne. So you got hustle bustle day and night from really 8 a.m. until 8 p.m, people moving about.
The Queen Street area of Melbourne in the 1980s was part of the Central Business District, and it still is to this day.
Very commercial, lots of national businesses have their headquarters there, lots of restaurants, coffee shops to feed the office workers.
Now it's a major city hotel, but in 1987, the building at 191 Queen Street was home to several large businesses, including the national headquarters for Austrailia Post.
They had several floors. It was also the headquarters of the Telecom Employees Credit Union, which was on the 5th floor. was also a number of other offices. There was about between 850 and 1,000 people worked in that building. 18 stories high on the corner of Littleburg and Queen Street.
On December the 8th, 1987, staff in the building on Queen Street were going about their daily business.
We were on the 11th floor. It was an open plan building, and in those days you could walk in and you could go to any floor you liked. There was some security on some floors, like there was the Telecom Credit Union on the 5th floor, which had obviously some security. December the 8th for me was a busy working day. Nothing out of the ordinary, but it was a very busy day. It was obviously close to Christmas, and we were wrapping up the financial reporting for the previous month.
I worked on the 11th floor in Queen Street, Australia Post, in the revenue and expenditure area, revenue and accounting area.
I worked on the 14th floor of the Australia Post building. I knew all of the people by name on our floor, but Australia Post had maybe 14 or 15 floors. You knew a lot of people to nod to or to say g'day to in the lift.
Also that morning, inside his home in the quiet suburb of Preston, 10 kilometres north of Melbourne, a young student by the name of Frank Vitkovic was preparing for the day ahead.
Frank Vitkovic was 22 years old, single, lived at home with his mum and dad. His father came from Yugoslavia, his mum was Italian. They both emigrated to Melbourne in the 60s, had 2 children. Lily, Frank's older sister, she was about 3 years older than him. He still lived at home at the time.
Frank Vitkovic was a good guy, as I knew him. He was pretty intense. He kept to himself a lot. He was intense and he loved his tennis. He was passionate about his tennis.
The young Frank Vitkovic had a troubled childhood and was often bullied at school.
He needed to go to the toilet when I was at church mass one day, and the teacher wouldn't let him. And he wet his pants, basically, and then had to go back to the classroom and was told to sit elsewhere because, you know, he was obviously a bit smelly. And his classmates, boys being boys, embarrassed him and talked about that and laughed at him. He then talks about shortly after that incident, he was actually naked in the changing rooms after sport when one of the boys noticed that his penis was different to the others. In Australia, it's quite common for boys to be circumcised. Vitkovic wasn't, which meant that his penis was different to theirs.
This sense of being different would come to characterise his early life.
Frank Vitkovic was very isolated and depressed, and I think he spent a lot of time ruminating about these things, about things that people had said or done or treated him badly and so on. And as he ruminated, as he went over and over these things in his mind, they took on bigger and bigger and bigger proportions until they led to this obsessional need for revenge.
However, this anger and bitterness didn't hamper his studies, and he gained a place at the prestigious Melbourne University Law School. Soon, though, Vitkovic's education began to be affected by a sense that he was being marginalised by society.
While I was at university, he had to prepare an essay, and his lecturer, when he read that essay, became very concerned about Vitkovic's state of mind, in that it was completely bizarre and off-topic, including at one stage he talked about how vital it was that all civil libertarians should be shot dead. That lecturer then told the counsellor at the university, and 2 appointments were made in December 86, sort of 12 months before the actual incident. And he had quite long conversations with that counsellor where he talked about he'd had suicidal thoughts.
I think Frank Vitkovic had built up a hostility towards the world in general. He felt the world in general had given him a raw deal and was treating him badly. So it wasn't simply about revenge against one person or a small group of individuals. He really wanted to get his own back on the world that he saw as having treated him so badly.
Good morning. It looks like it's been a good day too, particularly weather-wise.
Some sunny periods, dry, mild, around about 21 degrees, and weather like that for the next couple of days, even into the mid-20s by the start of the weekend.
On the morning of December 8, 1987, Frank Vitkovic woke and prepared for what he called his mission. He got a bag out, he put a change of clothing in there, he put binoculars in there, he put a knife in there, he put a sawn-off M1 carbine automatic rifle in there, and at least 200, possibly 300 rounds of ammunition. Made a final entry in the diary that he had been keeping for a number of years. And the final entry was basically, today's the day I'm going to do it, and headed off on a tram to Melbourne University, where he went straight to see Mary Cook, who was a woman who worked at the reception area, who he'd become friendly with during his time there as a student. He went to the counter. She was concerned about his state. He was not looking as smart as he normally was, and she said, anything wrong? And he said, yes, I've failed 3 subjects and I've deferred for a year. And she said, oh, you know, is there anything I can do to help? I can get you to see a counsellor if you like. Frank turned to her and said, I'm sorry, I can't. I've got a job to do at the post office.
A few hours later, Vitkovic and 8 others would be dead, and the city of Melbourne would be changed forever. On the 8th of December 1987, a young man boarded a tram in suburban Preston and headed into Melbourne. His name was Frank Vitkovic, and within just a few hours, he and 8 innocent people would be dead. One of the last things Vitkovic did before leaving home that morning was to make a final entry into his diary, where, in plain, simple language, he told the world what he was about to do.
He talked about his troubled mind, about how he couldn't help himself, that he knew one day he was going to do something really violent and that he was going to kill people. It was a gradual build-up. He was a volcano waiting to erupt. He was a time bomb waiting to go off. And it went off on December the 8th, 1987.
Inexplicably, in his own mind, Vitkovic had channeled all his anger onto one man, a man he believed was somehow responsible for all his problems. This unsuspecting individual was his former friend and tennis partner, Con Margellis.
Frank Vitkovic and Con Margellis had known each other since primary school. They went to the same primary school, the same secondary school. Con was one of Frank's few friends. He didn't have many friends. That relationship soured when, in late 84, early 85, Frank damaged his knee whilst out jogging.
I remember that he was injured and it frustrated him because he wanted to play tennis. He couldn't play A to the level that he wanted to and B as much as he wanted to.
Con, in Frank's mind, wasn't as supportive as he should have been. In fact, he used to laugh at the fact that Frank was no longer as fit, and Frank started putting on a bit of weight and getting chubby. And in Frank's mind, Con was not a true friend, and that was basically the start of the troubles between them. Very strong friendship for a number of years fell out over the knee.
On that December afternoon, Vitkovic had made up his mind that Con had to pay for his supposed betrayal of their friendship.
Frank made his way to 191 Queen Street, entered at the ground floor at about the 4 o'clock mark. He was seen on the 9th floor, around about 4:05, carrying a bag. He then went at 4:16, and we know that because of the CCTV footage, to the counter of the Telecom Employees Credit Union. He stood patiently at that counter, waiting to be served. A woman came to the counter and said, "What do you want?" And Frank said, "I'd like to see Con Margellis, please." That lady then walked behind the counter out of sight to where Con's office was. Con then came to the counter, and even though he hadn't seen Frank for a number of months because they'd become estranged, he greeted Frank with a cheery hello. It was at that point that Frank pulled a gun that he'd hidden underneath his jacket out, pointed it at Con, and pulled the trigger almost immediately. It misfired, didn't go off. Con said, "You've got to be joking," and then fled, along with the 4 or 5 other people that were on that floor at the time that had heard the commotion.
My partner and myself were acting as 503, which is the afternoon car for the City of Melbourne. Therefore, any crime in Melbourne comes to us.
I want media liaison advised for all people in buildings in Queen Street to keep away from the shop windows, please. We've got people speaking out the windows.
We got a call from our D24, which is our police dispatch, and we were just told, shots fired in Queen Street, your job. Off we went.
All units to wear flak jackets.
I was inspecting the prisoners at the City Watch House, and I had a portable radio with me, and then a call came over from D24 in relation to an armed robbery at 191 Queen Street. Following that, there was another call to the effect that shots had been fired. So at that stage, I got on the radio to D24 and just advised them that I'd be on the way.
So we moved on real quick, lights and sirens, and we hit the tram tracks in the centre of the street and took off towards Queen Street.
Back at 191 Queen Street, the 5th floor was a scene of chaos. Staff were confronted by a gunman, Frank Vitkovic, who was chasing them around the office to prevent them escaping.
Frank then lifts the gun up, fires it at Con as Con is fleeing away, misses Con and hits 19-year-old Judy Morris, who was standing in between where Frank was and where Con was fleeing. She became the first victim on level 5.
Con Margelis had taken cover in the toilet, terrified the gunman would track him down. He would ultimately survive the massacre. Vitkovic, meanwhile, unable to find Con, had new targets in his sights.
It became more than just about Con. Frank obviously decided that he was going to die that day. He wanted to kill Con first, couldn't find Con, so he decided that others would have to die.
This was his way of righting this terrible wrong that had been done to him, almost, I suggest, symbolically through this one person. But then, as we know, through as many other people as he could kill, this general anger towards the world and society.
With one person dead on the 5th floor, Frank Vitkovic decided to leave that level and go hunting for more victims. He chose the supposedly secure 12th floor. The entrance to the offices were protected by a security door. However, the procedure that restricted access was fundamentally flawed.
Employee John Dirac got up from his desk, walked, looked through the small window, couldn't see any reason why he shouldn't open the door. The minute that door was opened, Vitkovic levelled his gun at John Dirac and shot him.
John Dirac would survive the shooting at Queen Street. Other workers wouldn't be so fortunate.
Immediately after shooting Dirac, Vitkovic heard 20-year-old Julie McBean scream. He then walked straight towards her and was heard to say at the time, and he was cocking and recocking his gun. That's when he first realised it could only fire one at a time, and he was fiddling with it, and he actually said, "They expect me to kill people with this gun." He then walked up to her and shot her twice. Victim number 2. After killing Julie, Frank walked into a partitioned office where David Spencer, 38, was hiding. He was heard to say, "Please no." Vitkovic ignored that, shot him. He then turned and walked out of that office towards 18-year-old Nancy Avignon, who was lying on the floor under her desk, again pleading for her life. He shot her twice from about 3 meters away, wounding her each time. He then walked straight up, put the gun to her head, and finished her off.
With the death toll now at 4, police were beginning to assemble outside on Queen Street.
We were the first to arrive at the scene, the first detectives, and there's a couple of uniforms just getting out of cars. And what we saw was cars were blocked in the street, and there was shots fired from high above in a glass tower.
Meanwhile, workers on other floors in the building were beginning to realise something was terribly wrong.
It wasn't long before someone noticed out the window that there was a car parked across Queen Street and there was police activity out there. There's probably 8 or 9 of us looking out the window thinking, what's going on, what's going on? Well, it was probably only a few minutes after that that we heard on the 12th floor, bang, 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 and then realised, something's on here.
At the same time, Glenn Schilling, who worked on level 14, was heading for the lifts to begin his journey home as shots rang out.
On the way down, I heard several fairly loud bangs When I got to the ground floor, I went to get out of the lift, and there was a couple of policemen that were taking a bit of shelter behind a couple of pillars.
The police told Schilling to get back in the lift and go back up. There was another person in the lift with Schilling, and that person pressed the lift to the 11th floor. Schilling wouldn't normally have gone to the 11th because he worked on the 14th.
We heard a couple of more bangs, and he got out at the 11th floor. And I thought, what I'll do is that I'll get out on the 11th floor so that I could have a look out the window to see if I could see what was going on. There were several police cars with police officers sheltering behind the cars, just like you would see on television or in the movies.
After shooting Nancy on level 12, Frank made his way down to level 11 by the fire escape.
A colleague came running and said, you better hide because he's coming to this floor. Some people ran with him, and I think they went into the computer room. Some people hid under desks. The noises got louder, and then I heard firearm discharge.
As he walked in through the swinging doors onto level 11, Michael Maguire, 38, married with 3 kids, spotted him, obviously scared, ran into an office.
Michael Maguire had run into the very office where Glenn Schilling was observing the mounting chaos on the street below.
It was then that I had the oh shit moment where I thought, now I know what's going on.
The gunman came running up the aisles, and all the time he was discharging the firearm. It sounded automatic, but sometimes it would stall, and then he would swear and say, you know, you're all going to die. Where's the police? Why aren't they here? I'm going to kill you all that sort of stuff.
Unfortunately, the gunman had seen Michael Maguire and shot him once. I had jumped under a desk. Michael was pleading for his life. He was saying, please don't shoot me. I decided the best course of action was just to stay hidden and hope that he wasn't aware that I was there. He then walked back to Michael, who was still in great distress, and he just walked over and held the gun barrel about an inch away from Michael's scalp and shot him again. The gunman walked out, and I heard Michael's last couple of breaths, and then he was silent.
5 people now lay dead in the building, with several more severely wounded and in desperate need of medical attention. With police still outside, the death toll was set to rise again. In the heart of Melbourne, a gunman was out of control, stalking the floors of a Queen Street office block. By now, 5 people had been killed and many more injured. The shooting had only been going on for a matter of minutes, but already police were surrounding the building.
We'd ordered the SWAT team some 3 minutes earlier, and we were told they were 15 minutes away. And I remember saying, 15 minutes? Fuck that, it can't be 15 minutes.
What we didn't know was how many offenders there were, because there were calls coming through to D24 saying that a person was on the 5th floor, on the 12th floor, on the 11th floor. There were shots being fired, and because it was such a fluid scene, we weren't able to confirm whether there was 1 or 2 or more offenders. We were still acting on the basis of the fact it was an armed robbery, and considered the fact it was an armed robbery had gone wrong, and that's why the shots had been fired.
Tragically, robbery was the last thing on Vitkovic's mind.
Vitkovic walked across level 11, firing at random, saying, "You're all scum." He spotted Don McElroy in a corner, fired, hitting him once. Don McElroy then fell against the window, a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Queen Street, and smashed that window. Vitkovic then walked away for about another minute, again firing random shots. McElroy was screaming in pain. Vitkovic walked up to him and said, "You're giving me a lot of trouble, fat man," and shot McElroy again. McElroy survived. His next victim was Marianne Van Eyck, 38. She was quivering with fright, obviously scared. Vic walked up to her and said, "Don't worry, I'm going to put you out of your misery," held the gun to her head, fired once, making her victim number 6. Catherine Dowling and Rosemary Spiteri were also hiding under their desks on level 11. Vic started firing at them, hit Kathy, killed her, wounded Rosemary. He then went up to Rosemary at close range and shot her in the neck. She survived. Catherine didn't. At this point, Vic spotted Frank Carmody.
Well, I was looking for an opportunity. I was praying to God to give me that opportunity. It just sort of happened. Like he said, this gun is jamming, so I thought, this is it, go for it, man. I didn't pre-think it or anything. I'm no hero. It's just a matter of survival. That's what it was, survival.
Frank went for him, and I don't think he was able to get on top of him, so the gunman shrugged him off and actually shot him.
I felt this burning sensation go through me, It didn't sort of super hurt, but it was just a burning sensation.
After wounding Carmody, Vic walked over to Rod Brown, shot him dead. Rod Brown became victim number 8. Tony Joya was hiding at this stage, saw Rod Brown get murdered, and Tony was convinced that he was going to be next.
I thought he had his back to me then, and at that moment I decided to jump him. We wrestled, and I think we both fell on top of Frank, maybe, and I think somebody took the gun off him. Another lady came out of her hiding place, took the gun off them.
She had it off and hid it in the fridge.
We were grappling with the gunman. I think I was on top of him, Frank was next to me, and Don and McElroy and Claire Chalkley sort of sat on him.
Imagine this, they're on the floor, they've got the gun away from him, but Vic is desperate, he's crawling towards the broken window, and he's trying to shake these people off. It's at this point that Vic's obviously decided, I haven't got the gun anymore, I can't shoot myself, which was probably his intention. He's lost that option, he sees the window, and he's obviously decided to hurl himself to his death.
He was fighting hard, he was trying to get away, and wasn't saying anything, just, muffles and groans and things like that. There was no words.
He's a big bloke, he's crawling along, he crawls through the broken window, cuts his stomach and head shockingly, bleeding profusely, and he's trying to kick them off.
I tried to stop him. I had him by his ankles, and somebody had hold of me because they were worried that I would go over as well.
And he was actually able to reach a point where his ankles were where the window was broken and the rest of his body was hanging over the balcony, and he desperately wanted to plunge to his death.
On the street, police and witnesses below were observing the chaos on the 11th floor with a sense of confusion.
We thought, it's a victim trying to free himself. And of course you would. Why would you think any different? And we watched this victim for this minute and a half, which again seemed like an hour. And then eventually we saw another person that his hands were hanging onto the victim. So we could see a struggle, and this didn't make sense. Why would an offender be struggling with a victim? And all this was racing through our mind as the adrenaline's pumping, trying to analyse it. And then we saw something extraordinary. The person, mostly out of the window, seemed to fight off his saviour, and then he was free.
And down he went, 11 floors, face down, into the pavement. Police that saw him fall witnessed that body bounce to the height of a car.
There's a man looks like he's got from into the building with a dead man looks like on the footpath, and I'm not quite sure. He's right in front of me, please. Stand by.
And I had to step back, quite literally, I had to step back as he fell where I was standing.
The time of his death was recorded by police at 4:34 and 34 seconds, meaning he killed 8 people in less than 17 minutes.
Police on the ground had little time to reflect on this horrific scene. They had to work out who this person, who had fallen to their death just metres from them, actually was. Was it a hostage or the gunman?
Something fell out of his pockets in this impact, and it was a magazine, and it was for a high-powered weapon, and the bullets, the rounds, fell out of the magazine and just rolled away in the sunlight, just rolled away. I kept yelling to myself internally, think it through, work it out. Why have you got somebody here with a magazine and rounds, bullets just fell out of that? It has to be an offender.
After the gunman had gone out the window, Tony was yelling out, "They're all dead. Rod's dead, Kathy dead, Marianne's dead." He came over to me and he said, "Don't die, Frank. Don't die."
So we charged in, all the detectives and the uniforms charged in. As soon as we pressed the lift button, the lift opened and there was these crazy victims in there, blood-stained, hair raised, eyes were sort of almost electrified, screaming and coming at us, and they saw us with guns and they balked and yelled and screamed because all they knew was guns, and you couldn't help but understand later on that they probably thought we were offenders with guns.
Immediately news of the massacre was broadcast, anxious relatives went to the inner city building. Some didn't hold back emotions when loved ones emerged unharmed. Others simply couldn't control their anger.
At that point, I was finding it hard to breathe. I knew there was a lot of blood coming out of me. It was dripping down over my face, and my breathing was going. So I knew I'd been hit in the back. So it was just then a matter of waiting. We could hear the police helicopter buzzing around outside. And it wasn't that long before they came in. The ambulance followed, and the ambulance guy sort of put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You'll be all right, mate, you'll be okay." They cut me tie off, and there's another stupid thing to think of. I thought, that's my best child, it's Christian Gill.
Once the lift doors were open and I stepped into this crime scene, it was no doubt the worst I'd ever seen. And I don't think that's an overstatement at all. I remember a woman saying, "He's over there, he's over there." And she was pointing towards the window. So I moved closer and closer to the window. It's a big office building. And then eventually I got to one particular victim and I was yelling, "Where's the offender?" And he said, "He's out there, he's gone out the window, he's gone out the window, singular." And then I confirmed it. How many were there? Just one. Are you sure there's only one? Just one. What did he have? A gun. What sort of a gun? And they said, "It's in the fridge, it's in the fridge." What? The gun's in the fridge. None of this was making sense. Then I turned to the tea room and you could see a big upright refrigerator. So we opened the fridge and there is the assault weapon, the rifle.
This is a city, a society that's never experienced this sort of thing before. And I just stop and think, what more can we do? Young people, 18, 19, 20, just starting out their working life, just shot down like that. I mean, what do you do?
The obvious question to be asked after the massacre was, how did he get that gun? How was he able to have a semi-automatic rifle that was, had it been operating properly, could have fired off 30 shots in a matter of seconds? The truth is, there were no revelations. He was perfectly entitled to it. He was a 22-year-old bloke with no prior history. He applied in the normal way to the licence registry. He presented all the documents. He then went and legitimately bought an M1 carbine semi-automatic capable of firing 30 shots in a matter of seconds, quite legitimately, put a deposit down, went back a week later and bought the gun.
With the immediate danger over, the police's job changed from hostage rescue to detection. Their key task was to identify who the gunman was and why he decided to carry out the atrocity. In December 1987, an army of police, legal and mental health experts began to gather. They were tasked with determining why 22-year-old Frank Vitkovic had killed 8 people before throwing himself off the 11th floor of a Melbourne office block. The survivors of the massacre, meanwhile, faced their own demons.
I just kind of couldn't come to grips with the fact that it had happened and that it was something that I could immediately talk about, and at that stage I had no idea what was going to happen next.
I don't think I believed he was coming home until he walked in the door. When he walked in the door, he didn't look like Glenn. He stank. The smell of fear. I never believed you could smell fear. He absolutely stank. I've never smelled anything like it, and I never want to smell it again. That night, Glenn didn't speak much at all. He was very zombie-ish. After my parents had gone home, he started to speak to me, but he spoke in a monotone, and it was like a robot talking to me, and he just spoke the whole incident through.
On the evening of the incident, I don't think I slept at all. I can't really remember, but I don't recall nodding off at all. And I got up the next morning and I thought, well, I should go to the doctor. And I really didn't know why I was going to the doctor, because he couldn't do anything, but I figured that's the place you should head. So I went to the doctor and I just howled the whole time I was there, and I said to him, I'm crying my eyes out, but I really don't know why.
It was devastating. We all knew each other, we all, socialised with each other, and I mean, the initial time that I was in hospital, it was unbelievable. You just couldn't grasp that this was real and that you wouldn't see these people again, It was just unbelievable.
In the weeks afterwards, I spent most of my time home. I don't think I went out. And my family shielded me from various people who wanted to talk to me, mostly from the media. But I did see some people from senior management Australia Post, and also some psychologists. Mark Creamer was one of those people that I saw.
In this kind of incident, some of the most difficult things that people have to confront are being very close to the death and suffering of others, and seeing somebody else, in this case, being shot or killed, and often in a prolonged and somewhat sadistic kind of way. So that's very difficult. And another part that's extremely difficult is where there's a moral complexity in terms of one's behaviour. How do I decide what to do in this situation? And the kind of factors that determine whether you perhaps try and run away, or whether you try and fight the assailant, or whether you hide. These are very, very difficult decisions to make in that moment, and often afterwards can lead to a whole series of problems. In this case, we had a group of people in a city office block. The last thing they could possibly ever conceive of happening was a gunman coming into their workplace, a safe environment, and killing them, their colleagues and friends.
Detectives investigating the shooting were beginning to realise that the situation that developed on Queen Street could actually have been far worse.
Because of the amount of ammunition that Vitkovic had with him, it could have been much worse because of the fact it was in a confined space. But to a degree, what reduced the number of victims was the fact that the alterations Vitkovic had made to the firearm actually made it work as a single shot more so than an automatic. But had he not done that and had the spring on the trigger mechanism or the bolt actually work smoothly, he would have been able to injure or kill a lot more people.
Despite being a semi-automatic, Vitkovic's gun was faulty, meaning he had to load each bullet manually, something he struggled to do. Many witnesses told of him constantly fiddling with the weapon as he prowled the floors of the building. Nevertheless, he still managed to fire over 40 rounds during the killing spree.
Not only did he not have a weapon that wasn't operating properly, but he wasn't familiar with it either, and he wasn't even doing it as a single shot, so it became a single shot instead of a repeat semi-automatic. Once he'd failed to get Con, he was obviously not going to stop until somebody stopped him. Either the police, which was probably his intention, he would have just kept shooting people. You know, heaven knows how many more there would have been had that gun operated correctly.
Desperate to uncover the gunman's motivations, police visited Vitkovic's home in Preston. They went to quite extraordinary lengths, literally throwing evidence out of one of the windows.
They then said, is it okay if we search Frank's room? And they got permission to do so. Didn't have a search warrant. Very quickly they found Frank's very extensive, many-page diary. This was a vital piece of evidence. It goes to the heart of why he did it.
The diaries were classic diaries. They were writings of a person, but these writings were dark. These writings probably were a great indication of what was to come.
It was basically his mission spelled out in this diary. They then overheard that the family were a bit concerned that maybe they shouldn't have let them in there without a search warrant, and they actually picked up the phone and they were starting to ring the family lawyer. They put the diary and some other items in 2 plastic bags, threw the bags out of Vitkovic's bedroom window, then went and had a bit more chat to the family and then left, and came back later and went round the side of the house, got those bags and took them. And gee, whilst I'm not condoning police breaking the law, because they did steal that diary, they fetched up to the coroner, told the coroner what he'd done. The coroner was a bit upset but took no further action because the coroner was convinced, like them, that this really was a vital piece of evidence.
It's very clear from the diaries that Frank Vitkovic was a very disturbed young man. He had a chronic knee injury and was very isolated, so he wasn't able to partake in the activities he used to. He became very depressed, a kind of agitated depression, and he started to ruminate excessively about things that had happened to him and the way the world had treated him and the way individuals had treated him. He gradually became more and more angry, more and more obsessed with the idea of revenge against the world and against individuals who had hurt him.
The diary was incredibly important because it was basically what he intended to do, how he intended to do it, and what drove him to do it. Had they not had that diary, it would have been a mystery. People today would be saying, what drove him to that? We now know what drove him to it because of that diary.
I don't think there's any doubt that if we had had access to those diaries prior to the shootings, that would have been a very, very powerful warning sign. I think that there's enough information in those diaries to warrant a significant intervention to try and prevent this happening.
With the questions over the killer's motivations seemingly answered, the inquest that followed the massacre shone an uncomfortable light on the actions of the police that day, with claims that they waited too long before entering the building.
If there was criticisms about how long it took for us to get to the 11th floor and to lend assistance, then I accept those criticisms. It is one of the most horrific crime scenes you could ever imagine, And the most important thing for me as the first detective on the scene was to assess everything and get information back to our control room, and that will then get the appropriate resources running towards that crime scene, driving towards that crime scene. And if I'm criticised for that, I'll take the criticism.
Even now, years later, it is still hard to believe that at 4 o'clock on a December afternoon in 1987, the building on Queen Street in Melbourne became the setting for an unthinkable act of violence.
What happened on December the 8th, 1987 certainly changed my life and my family's life forever. It's been 30 years since, but the incident might as well have been yesterday.
The Queen Street incident changed Glenn forever. He doesn't talk about it at all. It is never mentioned in this house. I could count on one hand the number of times Queen Street has been discussed in this house in the last 30 years. It's just never mentioned.
I look at it from a positive point of view. That is that I had 30 years bonus in my life. I've seen my children grow up, get married, have their own children, and forever thankful that I survived.
What happened on Queen Street that day has just totally affected my life. The emphasis on having, you know, the big job, plenty of money, flash cars, that was sort of put in the background, and the fact of, you know, having your life, having your family, and being able to be at home with them there, watch your kids grow up, all these things were just number one.
The reaction from Victorians following the Queen Street massacre was one of just shock, in that it must be remembered that there hadn't been a mass shooting for decades, almost as far back as anybody can remember, and yet within the space of a few short months you had Julian Knight, a failed army Duntroon student who went crazy in Hoddle Street and, you know, shot dead 7 people. 4 months later you've got Vic doing the same and killing 8 people. And people were thinking, is this the new norm? Is this what life in Melbourne is going to be like from now on? And remember, this is before terror incidents were the norm.
It still resonates today. Everybody knows about the Queen Street. We don't have to mention that it was Australia Post or it was a bank building. The fact it was Queen Street conjures up all sorts of horrible memories. 30 years later, it's still one of the worst crimes Melbourne's ever suffered. And I would put it up there with probably one of the worst in Australia.
During the 1960s, one man would leave a trail of destruction across Victoria that would span 20 years.
After the bodies were found, well, everything really got worse and worse.
Her throat has been cut from ear to ear. She had obviously been sexually assaulted.
The killer's identity would remain a mystery, and he would be known only by a nickname:
The name Mr. Stinky was created because some of the victims described a smell, but they couldn't nail what the smell was.
A chance discovery would eventually lead police to one of Australia's most prolific sexual predators.
I saw the print on the window of the car and thought, oh, I've seen that before.
And chilling revelations from the killer himself.
He said, get me a priest and I'll tell you everything.
The murders and rapes committed by Raymond Edmonds were crimes that shook Australia. The town of Shepparton lies almost 200 kilometres northeast of Melbourne. In the 1960s, it was a flourishing agricultural town with a booming population.
Shepparton in the 1960s was a thriving regional centre. It was the hub of a vast farming area, orchards, all that sort of thing.
You felt like you knew everybody and you were safe and involved in sport and just community activity. It was a good place to be.
As a teenager in the 1960s, in Shepparton we would go to dances, concerts.
66 in Shepparton, as it was around really the Western world, was the boom time for rock and roll. Big bands would come to Shepparton because it had a great big memorial hall and they knew they could draw thousands of kids from across the entire district.
It was exciting. And, you know, you'd be looking around and you'd be seeing all these young people that were just so happy and so glad to be there. It was really fun.
On the 10th of February 1966, locals in Shepparton were preparing for a rock and roll concert at the dance hall. One of them was 16-year-old Abina Medill.
She always looked like she was having the best time. She'd smile all the time and giggle and laugh. And she was definitely enjoying her teenage years.
She certainly wasn't boisterous or noisy, just a typical Shepparton kid, you could say, and loved life, attractive, she was popular.
Abina had recently started a relationship with Ian Urquhart, an apprentice mechanic from the town who was 2 years older than her.
Ian was a very happy, jovial person. He was always into doing pranks and he was just absolutely full of life.
He was a happy-go-lucky sort of a kid, not much worried him. He was into motors and things like that. He'd done his apprenticeship. Because he was so small, I used to get in a few bloody brawls because he'd get picked on a bit. He was a good mate. He was probably, back in them days, my best mate.
Bina was the first girlfriend he ever had.
They know each other, they've got together, they've gone out a little bit.
On the night of the concert, Ian Urquhart decided he needed to work late at the garage, so he arranged to meet his girlfriend Abina later that evening.
He was very keen on cars and actually he was a workaholic. He would have worked instead of going to the concert.
What Ian didn't know was that Abina had arranged to meet with another local boy, Gary Hayward, who she worked with at the local panel beaters.
Gary Hayward was one of the young bucks around town. He was well known. For a start, his family were very well established in Shepparton. His family, the Haywoods, owned the big panel beating works. As such, he was sort of Shepparton royalty in a way. And he was the tall, good-looking young bloke. He had the good FJ Holden, which was the much coveted old car at the time that would be done up. He'd spray painted it.
He was as proud as Punch when he drove his car, and he sort of drove around saying, hey, look at me, you know, I've got the good car and I work in a pretty well-known panel beating business, and he had the world at his feet too, I guess.
Abina Medill has arranged with the female friend to meet Haywood and his mates, and they've arranged to meet them down the street and then to go to the dance. And Abina apparently goes off with Gary and they go parking down near the lake.
Abina and Gary were never seen alive again. Later that evening, Ian Urquhart went to pick up Abina from her home as planned, but unable to find her, he became increasingly worried.
Here we have Ian Urquhart, very anxious about his girlfriend. He finds out fairly swiftly that she's been knocking around with Haywood and his mates. So he was very angry about this. By midnight, people are getting anxious. Mr. Medill is worried because his daughter hasn't come home. By 3 o'clock, Mr. Medill has filed a missing persons report.
Now, I was working the night shift at 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. when we received a phone call from the Medill family that their daughter hadn't returned home. It was completely out of character for her that she didn't come straight home after she'd been, say, to the local dance. We immediately suspected something, was just that feeling there was something not quite right.
Now, the night is a mystery. Young Urquhart is running around looking for his girlfriend. Meanwhile, Abina's father is frantically looking, worried about his daughter and looking. Gary Haywood's father, Mr. Haywood, and Gary's younger brother, Alan, are looking for Gary in his car. Everybody's very, very disturbed because this is well out of the ordinary.
After searching all night and knowing that she was with Gary Haywood, I then knew that she was possibly in the car, which was well known to the police. It was an early model Holden car with a very loud exhaust, painted in what they'd call probably British green. And there was only two that colour and the same model in Shepparton, and we knew both cars. So it then became obvious that we were probably looking for Gary Haywood's car. And at 5 a.m, I'd dropped my partner off. He'd finished his shift, and as I was returning to the police station when I came across Gary Haywood's car, which was parked at an angle in Wyndham Street opposite the lake.
The discovery of Haywood's car was the police's first real clue, and the breakthrough they were desperate for.
It's pulled up quite roughly by the curb. It's not parked properly, and there's no key in the ignition, but it's unlocked.
People that knew Gary, they knew that he wouldn't have left his car anywhere. The boys back then, their cars were an extension of themselves.
So as soon as they saw it, they knew that someone else had driven the car, and therefore they grew very fearful.
A lot of people were saying and thinking they've just run off together. And that is what the people that knew them well were hoping for, because if they ran off together, they'd still be okay.
The parents of both Gary and Abina are by no means reassured by this. Although they hope it's true, something tells them that it isn't.
2 weeks later, and after a desperate and exhaustive search, the worst fears of Gary and Abina's friends and family would come true. On February the 10th, 1966, 2 teenagers disappeared from Shepparton, Victoria, after attending a concert in the town. Only hours after they were reported missing, people began to fear the worst.
The disappearance of Gary Haywood and Abina Medill was a big story. People were very worried about it. It was headline news. There were big searches mounted. There were, all the workers from Haywood's panel works went out and combed the river flats. Mounted police came. I think the local pony club went out on horses. People went out with dogs and sticks to keep the snakes away, looking through the long grass, looking for the missing teenagers. They find nothing. But a couple of days later, an old local fellow who's riding his bike across a bridge well away from Shepparton, he looks down into the dry creek bed and he sees a handbag. He goes down and picks it up and gives it to the police, and it turns out to be Abina's handbag. So that is yet another indicator that something bad has happened.
A search of the riverbed and the surrounding area provided no further clues. But the recovery of Abina's handbag meant the spotlight of suspicion was focused more and more on one person.
From the first night of the disappearance, Ian Urquhart is blamed. He's the one with the motive, it would seem.
Ian came under further suspicion when the police learnt about an outburst he made when he was told his girlfriend Abina had, in fact, spent the evening with Gary Haywood.
The police were parked outside the Medill's house. He got out of the car and he ran towards, he may not have presumed it was a police car. And he said, "I will kill the bastard." That would be just a word that was used flippantly.
I think Ian might have brought that on himself by saying those words, but that's the sort of thing I think often anyone would say when you're upset. "I'll get him," or whatever. But it might have been a throwaway line, but it obviously didn't help him.
"16 days after the mysterious disappearance of teenagers Gary Haywood and Abina Medill, a gruesome discovery was made on a rural property 40 kilometres south of Shepparton.
On the 26th of February, 2 young teenagers are going shooting. They go to a place called Murchison East, which is on the way to Shepparton, and they cut across country to go shooting near the Goulburn River. During that time, they smell something bad. They discover Abina's body. They're terrified and horrified. They run across country. They alert the grandfather of one of the boys.
We got a phone call from a farmer down at Murchison to tell us that one of his young relatives had come across what he believed was human remains. I, with other police, then attended the scene. We located the body of the female, which was in a very, very bad state of decomposition. Further out in a paddock, we found the body of Gary Haywood.
The police were soon able to establish that Abina had probably been raped. She was found stripped to the waist. She'd been bashed to death, presumably with a rifle, because they found a part of a rifle left there. And when they found Gary 300 metres from her body, they soon realised that he'd been shot because they saw a bullet hole in his temple.
When I heard the bodies had been found, I think I went into a kind of a bubble. I couldn't believe it, even though by that time we were expecting something like that.
I was playing tennis down at the Lawn Tennis Club here, and the word just whipped around the tennis courts like mad, and
it was heartbreaking, is what it was. It just, you get this physical pain. And she was such a beautiful girl. You don't know what to do or what to say, and you can't feel anything but pain.
It really set us back. It was just something that's never happened in our lives. We never lost anyone, and to have something like that happen was completely unbelievable.
Finding the bodies, all it did was confirm that these couple had in fact been murdered, which was what people were starting to assume. But it didn't put Ian in the clear. It just meant that he was now a full-blown suspect for a double murder. And the police did look at a lot of other people. They questioned many people, but they kept coming back to him because he seemed to be the obvious person with a motive.
He was persecuted by a lot of people, And if I'm allowed to say, I think the police as well hounded him.
After the bodies were found, well, everything really got worse and worse.
The police were really desperate because it was headline news for weeks. They had to come up with something. And that's why they were trying to break him to get some sort of a lead or something happening that they were doing their job and that we will solve this. Someone done this and we reckon you're the one. When Ian got taken down to the police station and interviewed, he got hit and slapped and kicked in different ways. He used to tell me about it. I said, that surely couldn't happen, and it did. And he was scared. He was really scared.
Ian came home one day and he said to me, that's it. I'm going to tell them I did it. Well, you could imagine what I went through trying to tell him not to do that. That's what they wanted.
They're really working hard on Urquhart because they think if they belt him enough and his mates enough that in the end one of them will just say, yeah, we did it, or he did it, or something.
The way Ian Urquhart was treated by police should never happen to anyone. Simple reason is you're found guilty, then that's the way you've got to be treated. But until you're found guilty, no one should be treated like Urquhart was treated.
Whilst Urquhart was the prime suspect, another vital clue the police had was the rifle part found at the scene.
It was obvious to the police that the murder weapon was a Mossberg rifle because they found a little piece of a Mossberg that had fallen off the rifle. They also were able to find empty shells and they could look at the firing pin marks on those shells. They were also able to remove a slug from Gary Haywood's body and examine that microscopically. All those things added up to a particular model Mossberg 22 rifle. The Mossberg was a terrific clue, and in the right hands, given some luck, it would have led fairly quickly to a potential killer. And it would later turn out that it had been sold to a particular person at a particular shop, and there should have been records of that transaction. But the police, for some reason, never found that out or found it out and didn't act on it.
Despite this missed opportunity, the police did have another lead, a set of fingerprints found on Gary Haywood's car, but they didn't match any of the current suspects. Little did the police know that 20 years later, these same fingerprints would be rediscovered and used to crack the case. Of course, this was of little comfort to prime suspect Ian Urquhart. Although not charged with anything, the weight of suspicion proved to be a heavy burden for the teenager.
Ian's life was affected dramatically. He felt that he could no longer live in the town. He just said, I've had enough. He said, I've got to go. And I said, but where are you going to go? He said, I don't know, I'm going to go. It was a situation where he was tormented badly. He wanted to come home. If he came home, he was damned. Well, how should he show his face here anymore? And if he stayed away, he's done it because, he's run away from the situation.
Ian Urquhart decided to leave Shepparton and Australia. He headed overseas and tried to leave the awful events of his hometown in his past. As time moved on, so too did the media attention, which was soon focused on another terrible series of events 160 kilometres away.
Donvale is in the eastern suburbs, Melbourne, near Templestowe, Doncaster, and it's probably an affluent, wealthy type of area.
The demography of a place like Donvale was young marrieds. There were a lot of young mothers there, women in their 20s with little kids, whose husbands had jobs that were predictable hours. They would go off to work at 7 in the morning or whatever it might be, and be gone for a long time because they'd have to go a long way to work and then drive home.
In the mid-1970s, this quiet residential area was being terrorised by a serial sexual predator.
Women started coming forward to police with tales which were uncommonly similar.
The method of entry into the house was almost identical every time.
The attacker was a man who was generally barefoot. He was very quietly spoken, moved very silently with his bare feet.
The words said by the offender were very, very similar.
Some women noticed he carried a long butcher's knife, a long narrow knife, such as is used by meat workers.
The name Mr. Stinky was created because some of the women, in fact, described a smell, but they couldn't nail what the smell was.
A sort of a sharp, nasty chemical smell, perhaps a bit like ammonia. This story made the media big time, and it was a sub-editor on a Sunday paper in Melbourne was trying to write a headline for it and looking for a nickname for this unknown rapist. And they were doodling names, and they're going Mr. Smelly, Mr. Pongo, and in the end he wrote Mr. Stinky, and it fitted the gap and it entered the lexicon.
Although no one could describe the smell with certainty, all the victims reported the rapist smelled of a pungent and unpleasant odour. This ever-present clue in the victims' statements pointed to one conclusion. Police were looking for one man. Police files would eventually contain details of over 30 attacks that detectives attributed to the rapist.
Eventually, the police are so keen to catch this man that they build a bust or an effigy of him based on the eyewitness of several victims. So they get a rather thick-set, pot-bellied looking man, sandy to red hair, a long straight nose, pasty sort of guy. They went to a massive amount of trouble, but it didn't turn up the lead that they desperately needed.
As detectives carried on in their diligent efforts to track the Donvale rapist, what they couldn't have realised was that in June 1982, their case was about to collide headlong with a long-forgotten double murder from 1966. In the early 1980s, Victoria Police were investigating a series of rapes in the Donvale area of Melbourne that took place between 1971 and 1977. The perpetrator left little in the way of evidence, but through patient detective work, police were on the verge of a breakthrough.
The unifying thing about the attacks, apart from the method, was that there weren't a lot of clues left. But the police, through diligent fingerprint work, were able to build up a composite of fingerprints. So they'd find one thumbprint here, one index finger there, and they'd get one from a window, one from a windowsill, and gradually they assembled a composite set of prints which they just named the Donvale rapist.
The use of fingerprints was still in its infancy in the 1980s. It was still pretty much the same as it was at the turn of the 19th century. There was no computers, there was no scanning of images or photos or even fingerprint forms.
The Medill Hayward murder at Shepparton had sort of receded into the distance. By the time we get to the early 80s, it's sort of ancient history. There'd never been any breakthroughs until the day comes when a young fingerprint expert has been looking at some old cold case stuff. He's been flicking through unsolved cases and the prints that are associated with each cold case.
On one particular day, I was looking through the folder for Shepparton. And as I was looking through, I saw the print on the window of the car and thought, oh, I know, I've seen that before.
And sure enough, he digged through his files and bingo, same prints as left on Gary Hayward's car. And that was a huge breakthrough and gave us hope that there was going to be an end to the mystery.
Despite using nothing more than a keen eye for detail, an incredible amount of patience and a huge stroke of luck, Andrew Wall had stumbled on a match between the prints found at the Donvale rape crime scenes and those found on Gary Hayward's car in 1966.
This was an amazing breakthrough. The police now knew that the Donvale rapist was at least present at the time of the Shepparton murders back in 1966 because they'd matched up a tiny fingerprint found on Gary Haywood's car, a fingerprint that had been kept secret for 17 years.
Although we had that link and it gave investigators something more to work with, we didn't know who it was or who they belonged to.
The discovery prompted the police to form a task force in May 1983 to find out who the prints belonged to. Norm Gillespie worked on the team. The tragic murders from his childhood in Shepparton had inspired him to join the police. He was now working on the very case he was witness to so many years before.
We knew everything about him, except who he was. It was frustrating. But we kept working and kept chipping away at it, and we had no luck, and the offender had all the luck.
With few leads left to explore, the task force was wound down. It seemed the killer had slipped the net once more. That was until 2 years later, when a local in the town of Albury, almost 250 kilometres from Donvale and across the border into New South Wales, made a call to the police.
It's March the 16th, 1985. A shop assistant in Main Street, Albury, looks out and sees a man exposing himself in a car parked in the street. She calls the local police.
A phone call came into the police station to say that some ladies in the store had complained about a male seated in a vehicle, and the male had allegedly, at that stage, been exposing himself. We arrived just before 12:30 p.m. I approached the car and observed what he was doing in the vehicle, masturbating, and I said to him, "What are you doing that for?" He immediately turned around, turned his head to the right where I was. We asked him his name, and he told me his name was Raymond Edmonds.
They take him in and charge him with willful and obscene exposure, a pretty simple offence. They routinely fingerprint him. Now, this man had never been fingerprinted before in his life. He's a man in his early 40s. They put the ink on his fingers, they put it on the pad, they put it on the white paper, they send it off to Fingerprint Central, and it finds its way through the system.
He was actually bailed to appear at the Albury local court on the Monday, the 18th of March. And in fact, he did appear there and he was fined. He pleaded guilty to the charge of willful and obscene exposure, was given a $400 fine by the magistrate, Mr. Werry, and we didn't think anything more of it.
Edmonds' prints made their way to the Central Fingerprint Bureau in Sydney, where incredibly they were spotted by a diligent detective. As he processed them, he noticed they matched a set of prints he'd been given by Victoria police officers 8 months earlier, during their search for the Donvale rapist. Finally, detectives had their man.
I was at home and I received a call from the Fingerprint Bureau, who excitedly said, "We've got him." They said, "Mr. Stinky, he's been printed in Albury."
Now, after 2 years of hard work and a huge piece of good fortune, detectives could match Raymond Edmonds' fingerprints to those found at the Donvale rape scenes, and the print they found on Gary Haywood's car back in 1966. After 2 decades, a double murderer and serial rapist who had remained anonymous for so long had just blundered into the hands of police.
Edmonds was a man that most men did not like. He was quiet, he was moody, he was a bit different in ways that people found hard to put their finger on. Women had mixed reactions. Some women seemed to quite like him and were sort of attracted to him. Many women found him scary, sinister, didn't like him, found him creepy. He was a man who'd been very careful to airbrush his own history. So if he went and worked somewhere, when asked where he'd worked before, he would alter it. He would make up false details, false addresses, false places of work, so that wherever he'd been, he laid a false trail, which of course is an indicator of guilt.
Investigators uncovered a story of an apparently ordinary working man who harboured a terrible secret. He was a violent sexual deviant who'd beaten and raped his first wife and also molested his daughter. On the 22nd of March 1985, detectives were finally able to arrest the man who they'd been looking for almost 20 years.
So, March the 22nd, 1985, 6 days after the Albury incident, the Victorian police are all over it. They know where Edmonds works. They go down to a small factory in the Bayside suburb of Hyatt, and they go in, and there in the office is Raymond Edmonds. He says, "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" And then they arrest him.
I was surprised why we hadn't had him earlier, because he looked so much like the circular that girls put together and it was distributed on the highways in Melbourne and on police circulars. I was amazed someone hadn't telephoned us and told us who he was.
My boss conducted sort of a pre-interview question and actually put it to Raymond Edmonds and said, "I put it to you that these fingerprints are yours." There was some silence for quite some time and a shake of the head denial.
Edmonds was reluctant to divulge anything much, but he seemed to undergo a change of heart, or more likely he realised that they had him cold.
My boss put it to him again, in which Edmonds, and it still sticks in my mind now, said, "Get me a priest and I'll tell you everything."
After speaking to a priest, Edmonds began to talk, but the police were well aware that they only had a limited time to question him.
There are rules in Victoria which limit the amount of time that a suspect can be questioned about a particular crime. Now, the police can get some extensions. They can do it for 6 hours and then get an extension.
So in effect, we had him for 18 hours, but that was nowhere near enough time to process him for the double murders plus all the rapes in Melbourne. We just didn't have the time. We only had time to process him on 5 of 30, but he admitted them. He said, "Yes, I committed them," but we didn't have enough time to find out, how did you choose that victim? How long had you been watching her? How did you know the husband would be away or the kids would be in the next room? We didn't have time.
Detectives were only able to put forward 5 of the 30 rape cases to Edmonds, plus the double murder in Shepparton. His response to the charges was that he was sick in the head and needed destroying. Although he agreed to take part in a reconstruction to help investigators piece together the events that led to the murders of Medill and Haywood, police were beginning to realise that his statement was riddled with lies. Edmonds had claimed that the gun he used in the killings was actually Gary Haywood's, but the police could prove otherwise.
One of the key parts of the evidence is the 22 Mossberg. Now, Edmonds initially denies ever having had one, but of course the police are able to go back and show that he did have one. They go to the farm at Ardmona near Shepparton, where he'd been a share milker in 1966 at the time of the double murder, and there they find the farmer's son, who'd been a young man back in 66 and he's now, in his 40s or whatever, and he says, "Oh, yeah, I remember him. He had this Mossberg rifle. It was one with a fold-out handle. I remember it well. We used to shoot rabbits and rats and all that." And in fact, he said, "Hang on," he said to the police, "I might have a bit of that somewhere. I found something, I thought it was an old air rifle stock. I found it in a shed after Ray Edmonds had left. And I kept it all these years." And he goes out to a shed and he gets a bucket, and in the bucket is this piece of gun stock. And as soon as the expert ballistics guy saw it, he said, "That's from a Mossberg 352K, and that's the weapon."
We were told, and it's been confirmed, that he shot this same firearm at tins on a fence post. And of course the spent shells must go somewhere. So we got excavators, we dug up all the area in which he was standing at the time, and all that soil was brought into Shepparton. It was sieved physically, standing there, shaking the sieves, and the spent shells dropped through. Our ballistics expert was able to say categorically it was the same firearm that discharged the spent shells at Ardmona as at the murder scene at Murchison East.
They were able to find out that he indeed, although he denied owning a Mossberg 22 rifle, in fact he had owned precisely the model of rifle, a 352K Mossberg, that was the murder weapon.
As police prepared for trial, they began to uncover more about Raymond Edmonds and his history of violence. What's more, they began to suspect he may have been responsible for even more horrifying crimes. After almost 20 years, police finally had the suspected killer of Shepparton teenagers Abina Medill and Gary Haywood in custody and ready for trial. The weight of evidence against Raymond Edmonds finally lifted the cloud of suspicion that for so long had hung over Abina's boyfriend, Ian Urquhart.
Ian Urquhart, the boyfriend, the innocent boyfriend who was wrongly accused and wrongly blamed and widely blamed for the murders for years and years. In fact, for the rest of his life, because he died 6 years after the murders. On the 6th anniversary of the murders, he crashed his MG sports car in Singapore and died. Now, whether there was any connection between the anniversary and his death, I don't know. But even at his funeral in Shepparton, a policeman who had led the interrogation of Ian Urquhart was still blaming him and said, well, he's got his right whack now, but he was wrong. It wasn't Ian Urquhart. A tragic figure in every way.
The day the news came through that someone had been arrested for the murders of Abina and Gary, we were all so happy, full of emotion, tears, and probably a big weight lifted off all of our shoulders. All of a sudden, all those people that had wrongly condemned my brother, at least after all those years, that question had been answered, that he was, as I used to say, totally innocent of the crime.
On the 3rd of April 1986, Raymond Edmonds appeared at Melbourne Supreme Court, charged with 2 counts of murder, 3 counts of rape and 2 counts of attempted rape. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 2 terms of life in prison for the murders and 30 years for the 5 rape charges. He will die in prison, but the question remained, could the so-called Mr. Stinky have been responsible for any other crimes?
What happens with these cases is that police then start combing through their records, looking for unsolved cases that might match up the MO of the crook. And one that stood out to everybody concerned was a chilling murder in 1980 of a woman called Elaine Jones. She was a young mother, an attractive woman. She's holidaying at a Murray River town called Tocumwal.
It was in early January 1980. Elaine Jones and her husband had been staying on holidays on the main beach at Tocumwal. Approximately 10 p.m, she realised, look, we're out of milk and we need to get some cigarettes as well. I'll go up to the local shop. It wasn't a very long walk. So she headed off to the shop about 10 p.m. We know that apparently she made it to the shop, but she never made it back to the campsite.
When Elaine Jones disappeared, her husband did not alert the police until next day. He'd hoped she would turn up. She doesn't turn up. Next morning he tells the police. He then goes searching for her himself. He's in a boat, he's got his 7-year-old daughter, and horror of horrors, he finds her body. Her throat has been cut from ear to ear, right through to the spinal cord. Mr. Jones is highly distressed when he sees his wife with his little girl there. He covers her body with life jackets and turns the boat around to go and get help when he has a massive heart attack and dies. The boat continues on for some minutes. The poor little 7-year-old girl actually ends up scrambling out of the boat and getting to the shore and saving herself, having seen her mother's body and seen her father die of the heart attack from the shock.
It was established at a post-mortem that Elaine Jones had not only been severe laceration to the throat, cut from ear to ear, she'd also been the victim of quite a horrendous beating with a blunt object or instrument to her head, and I believe she was also established that she'd been sexually assaulted.
I've always believed that Elaine Jones up at Tocumwal in 1980 is a victim of our same Raymond Edmonds.
Raymond Edmonds was staying in close proximity to that picnic area in Tocumwal at the time and on the night. He was quite close in vicinity to where Elaine Jones was attacked and murdered.
We know for absolute fact Raymond Edmonds worked as a slaughterman at the Wodonga abattoirs. We know that the way in which she was murdered was similar to a sheep being slaughtered. We know that he was camping on the Victorian side of Tocumwal at the time. Evidence could be given that he was there, and it's his MO, it's his modus operandi.
Based on, I believe he's done at least 30 attacks on women in Victoria, he is a very likely suspect for the murder of Elaine Jones. In 2011, a $100,000 reward was posted for seeking information that may lead investigators to arresting the person responsible. Unfortunately, no significant information has become available, and perhaps the only person that really knows what happened may well be Raymond Edmonds.
I've written to him myself, asking him, and I know he's got the letters, but I've never had a reply. It's just nags at you that, you know, you've got this total belief that he's the offender, but he won't admit it.
The tragic case of the murder of Elaine Jones remains unsolved, with only circumstantial evidence linking Raymond Edmonds to the crime. He is also the suspect in several other murders across Victoria.
The actions of Raymond Edmonds in 1966 had a profound effect on this area, in that we didn't feel safe anymore.
My thoughts were that I would like to get in the ring with him, with no gloves, and no one steps in. That was a hatred that I had, and today I do the same, but back then it was raw. It was bloody raw. For what he did, the pressure that he put on all the kids in Shep, I would have liked to have throttled him.
My brother Ian was badly affected by what had happened. Being an innocent party, it drove him out of that town, and he was driven to a life of loneliness.
Urquhart is a very interesting case because we, in this state, Victoria, we still had capital punishment in the 60s. We had a premier, a political leader, who was very keen to win an election by hanging a murderer. And in fact, that premier, Henry Bolte, insisted on hanging a prison escapee and murderer called Ronald Ryan. And he became the last man hanged in Australia in 1967. That was precisely when young Urquhart was being wrongly accused of murdering this couple. Had he signed a confession under duress and said, I did it, stop hitting me, he probably would have swung. That boy could have been the last person hanged in Australia, and he would have been innocent.
It took the conviction of Raymond Edmonds to finally exonerate Ian Urquhart, the tragic figure who for so long had lived under a cloud of suspicion. The forensic work that eventually caught Mr. Stinky also meant an evil killer was finally off the streets for good.
In the end, this whole case was solved by the scientific police. The ballistics guys, the fingerprint guys, they were the ones that solved it when the old-fashioned detectives who just dragged people in and belted them got nowhere.
It was brilliant work by Andy Wall originally, and the fact that fingerprints were carefully looked for and located on Gary Hayward's car and preserved and kept, and Andy Wall matched them with all the rapes in Melbourne. That was just brilliant, dedicated police work.
Had it not been for the development of the fingerprints on the car in Shepparton in 1966, I don't think Edmonds would ever have been charged or connected to the murder of Hayward and Medill, and potentially could still be at large today.
The crimes this man Raymond Edmonds has committed are the worst type of horror. They're evil.
The murders happened at a time when it caught public imagination, and then the fact that he wasn't caught for almost 20 years caught the public imagination all over again. On every level, he's a monster who deserves to rot in jail.
On the 12th of October 1988, Melbourne would be rocked by the news of a vicious double shooting.
It was cold-blooded, it was planned, it was an execution.
The victims were two innocent police officers investigating an abandoned car.
I just sat in the back of the ambulance and just cried and thought, this is pointless.
I'm not guilty of these charges.
The investigation into the shootings would uncover a tale of revenge.
She kept saying, help, help, McLaren, help, help, help me.
Violence and deceit.
My husband's in it.
They believed that the police were out to get them, and they decided then and there that it was going to be 2 for 1. For every criminal that was killed, they'd kill 2 police.
The brutal murders of 2 young police officers on Wall Street were crimes that shook Australia.
Melbourne in the 1980s for a detective was probably the most volatile it's ever been. If I look back, it was almost like a Western movie where you'd shoot first and ask questions later. That was the behaviour of the police back then, because they were quite often confronted with very, very violent men.
The vast majority of criminals still had a begrudging respect for the police. But with some of the armed robbery crews, they felt that they were in a competition with another gang, and that gang was the armed robbery squad.
There'd been bombings of police, there'd been shootings of police. Police felt they were in some ways under attack.
There's been a second explosion. Units, stay away from the area.
These groups would case banks, sometimes have inside information, and they would hit them with military precision. In the case of the armed robbery crew known as the Flemington crew, 2 of their associates had been killed by police. The police were told at that point that the Flemington crew had started to suggest that they'd been targeted and that they were going to fight back. It was then they learned of what was called the 2 for 1. You take 1 of our people, we'll take 2 of you.
It was in this brooding and volatile atmosphere that the seeds were sown for one of the most tragic incidents ever to befall the Victoria Police. To try and combat the spate of increasingly violent crimes, Victoria Police's armed robbery squad began to focus their attention on key figures in Melbourne's underworld.
The armed robbery squad had been targeting a number of criminals. They went out on the 11th of October to make an arrest on a fellow called Graham Jensen. And that really started a bleak period in Victoria's history.
Graham Jensen was a charismatic and violent criminal.
Jensen was wanted in relation to the attempted murder of a security guard. They followed him to an area in Narre Warren and they more or less bungled the arrest.
As a career criminal, he was wanted for many things, but the arrest that day at Narre Warren was for something he didn't do. Police chasing him, fired at the car, fired through the back windscreen and hit him in the head, killing him instantly.
To Melbourne's armed robbers, the death of Graham Jensen was viewed as nothing less than an execution by the robbery squad detectives. Their threat to avenge the death of one of their own by killing 2 police was about to become very real.
Graham Jensen was very close to Victor Pearce, who was the main organiser for the Flemington crew. As soon as his crew knew that Graham Jensen had been killed by police, they believed it was murder and they responded in kind. There was grief and there was anger, and very quickly they started to plan revenge.
Later that evening, there was a gathering of all of his friends in this apartment in Brunswick, and the flat was owned by Victor Pearce's sister. A number of his friends turned up there and were getting the news that Graham had been shot dead. They were putting together a piece of their puzzle. Of course, crooks' puzzles aren't necessarily always correct.
They believed that the police were out to get them, and they decided then and there that it was going to be 2 for 1. For every criminal that was killed, they'd kill 2 police.
Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre were 2 relatively junior police officers serving with the Victoria Police. Tynan was 22 and had joined the force 3 years earlier.
Constable Damien Eyre.
20-year-old Damien Eyre came from a police family and had served for less than 12 months.
Damien grew up wanting to be a policeman. Nothing else. Wanted to join the police force. Spent most of his kid days at the police station, belting on the old Olivetti typewriters. Got a collection of police journals and was just crazy about wanting to be a policeman.
Steve really enjoyed his job. I think helping people, working with the community. I said to him, well, as long as you have compassion, Steve, you'll be right. And he did. He was very compassionate.
The 2 young police officers were based at Parole Police Station, the district headquarters for Melbourne's inner-city suburbs. That October evening, they were assigned the call sign Parole 311. Their divisional van pulled out of Parole Police Station car park at 11:10 that night. Graham Jensen had been dead for less than 8 hours.
It was a typical sort of night shift for 2 young coppers in an inner city beat. They went to a noisy party, an alarm, someone complaining about being beaten up by their husband. Those sort of jobs went through the night, and then they got to the 9th case of the night.
It was a quiet night, and then a call came in that there's an abandoned car in Wall Street with the doors open.
Wall Street is a small street in an affluent area of Melbourne.
I got on the radio and called for any unit available.
311. 311, if you can slip down to Wall Street in South Yarra.
The closest police that could take the call was a Paran unit, manned by Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre.
There's a white
Holden sedan, not knowing what the rego is. Got the lights on and the smashed windows in the middle of the road.
Yeah, plans for 11 received that 26483.
Roger.
Constables Tynan and Eyre arrived in Wall Street and parked their van behind the abandoned car.
I don't know how long the interval was, but sometime later there was calls coming through that shots were fired in Wall Street.
South Melbourne 150, I sent Plan 311 down to Wall Street. There's a car, a white Holden sedan, parked in the middle of the road with the lights on and smashed windows. Since then I've had about 3 or 4 cars come down saying that they've heard shots fired in that street, and I can't get Plan 311 at this stage.
When the calls came through from the public about shots fired, I immediately was concerned, and I kept calling Plan 311 and anybody else in the area to check out their welfare.
You Nicole?
350, 2 members down, urgent.
Roger, need an ambulance?
Urgent, yes, ambulance, please. 2 members down.
City West 250, affirmative.
It was cold-blooded, it was planned, it was an execution.
As the 1980s drew to a close, Melbourne was in the grip of a bloody war that was raging between Victoria Police's armed robbery squad and a group of organised and heavily armed bank robbers. Tragically, on the 12th of October 1988, 2 young police officers found themselves caught up right in the middle of the conflict. At 4:39 a.m, Constable Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre responded to reports of an abandoned car in Wall Street, South Yarra.
This is such a routine matter. Go and have a look at a running sheet on any divisional van and you'll see dozens of these sort of events. Nondescript, routine. That's what made it so terrifying. They were junior police, but no police officer going to that scene, they could be 30-year veterans, would have suspected anything. A car in the middle of the road, abandoned. It happens every day. But this day, it was an ambush, and this day, it was cold-blooded murder.
They pulled up behind the stolen car. Damien went to the registration label on the passenger side, wrote down the registration number and the expiry date.
One got into the front seat and was looking at where the car had been jimmied to start it, and the other, his colleague squatted on the road beside him, talking to him by the open front door.
The offenders walked out of under a block of flats. Stephen Tynan was shot at close range to the head with a shotgun. Damien Eyre was shot across the back. He turned to struggle with the offender with the shotgun went off. He hit a wall in a house adjacent on the second story. His revolver was then taken from his holster and he was shot once through the head, close range. And when he fell to the ground, he was shot through the back and side that perforated his heart.
City West 250, affirmative. Yeah, we're getting one now.
When we first arrived, there were a number of police units already on scene. We were the first ambulance crew to arrive and followed shortly after by an intensive care ambulance. The first officer I attended to was Steve Tynan. He'd been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. The second officer, Damien, had been shot in the back with shotgun from some distance. So then we've, more so for the sake of his mates, we've intubated Steve and scooped him up and took him to Prince Henry's Hospital, and the other crew took Damien to the Alfred Hospital, where they were both unfortunately pronounced dead on arrival at hospital.
This case really affected, really upset, really hurt, because it was two of our mates. We might not have known them personally, but they were comrades in uniform. I just sat in the back of the ambulance and just cried and thought, this is pointless.
Now, while police had to keep an open mind, straight away, the first and the strongest theory was this is a payback for what happened just 12 hours earlier.
As detectives mobilised and began the daunting task of investigating the murders of two of their own, it was immediately apparent that they faced a challenging case.
Unfortunately, when you go to crime scenes, particularly from a homicide point of view, invariably a lot of those scenes have been contaminated. They're not protected the way you would like to. The scene for Wall Street was one of disarray, disorganised, and it hadn't been protected the way in which we wanted it to be.
We'd had bodies moved and the crime scene contaminated by probably emotions overriding judgment, which was probably humanly understandable, but from an investigator's point of view, very troublesome for us to try and reconstruct what had actually taken place.
Meanwhile, other officers were sent to carry out a much more difficult task.
I remember just standing still in front of the TV because I heard about this police shooting, and then going to bed after that. And then the next morning, hearing a knock, I looked out and saw two police. So, that was them coming to tell me about it.
Yeah, it was about, probably 4:30 in the morning, a bit after. There was a knock on the door, and immediately something wrong. They told me that there'd been a shooting and said that he and Steve Tyne were dead. So we jumped in the police car and went to Melbourne. Went to Parole and they were marvellous. Sorry.
I think it was a couple of days later that I just decided I have to say the words because I've got to acknowledge it. I knew I just had to acknowledge it. And I just said the words, Stephen is dead. And it sounds very, silly, but that seemed to help me.
As the task force, now named Thai Air in memory of the fallen officers, began to assemble, they were well aware of the pressures they were under.
The outpouring of grief and outrage from the general community, from the Premier down, was really impacted on the whole community. And within the police force, there was anger and there was a line in the sand. You cannot do this. We need to find these people.
When police are killed, the public would be quite right to think that the police would react with all guns blazing, so to speak. They would pull out every stop to make sure that they caught the culprits. With the Wall Street killing, it was probably a little bit different. Police command took the approach that they didn't want the police reaction to Wall Street to be seen by the public as anything over and above what they would do if it was two ordinary members of the public.
Setting up of the task force was a frustrating period. I was at the homicide squad at that stage. It wasn't until 10 days afterward that we were actually given any resources whatsoever.
They didn't have computers, they didn't have analysts. So all these information reports were coming in, all this intelligence was coming in, all these police wanted to help, but there was really no way of marshalling the intelligence.
Despite these challenges, the task force was making progress, and to the detectives, the same names were being mentioned, names they were well aware of. The notorious bank robbers known as the Flemington Crew.
Jensen was a member of the Flemington Crew, and as a result of him being killed, That was certainly one motive.
This theory received at least partial corroboration when officers checked the records of unsolved crimes involving shotguns. One case in particular stood out: an armed robbery at the Oak Park Bank in March 1988, 7 months before the murders.
3 robbers went in and immediately the security screens came down, so they needed to get through the door. They had a sledgehammer, that didn't work, so they fired 2 shots into the door. And that produced shotgun shells that had special markings on them when they were ejected and left. So when forensics came along after the bank robbery, they were there to pick up. At the scene of Walsh Street, shotgun shells had been fired, and it was a shotgun where each time you fire a shot, the shell pops out and it lies on the floor. It was dark, so they weren't picked up by the killers. So forensically, they were examined, and what was special about these shotgun shells was not the mark that fired it, but it's the scratching as they came out of the gun. And those scratchings as they came out of the gun in Walsh Street were identical to those scratchings on the shells in the Oak Park Bank. It was the same gun. There was a direct link now between a gang of bank robbers and the Walsh Street murders.
The gun was later found buried on a Melbourne golf course, although its condition meant it couldn't be tied to one person through fingerprints alone. But at least there was now a forensic link between the Wall Street murders and the Flemington Crew bank robbers. In an effort to find more evidence and arguably send a clear message to Melbourne's crooks, a series of raids took place across the city for weeks after the shootings. On one day, in December 1988 alone, over 100 police officers descended on shops, businesses and homes. Although the raids provided little in the way of specific evidence, police were presented with a key witness, teenage gangster Jason Ryan, the nephew of Flemington Crew mastermind Victor Pearce.
Jason Ryan was a 17-year-old at the time of the Wall Street killings. Jason had been involved in burglaries and he was a thief, he was a drug taker.
Jason came to us in the early days as a result of a raid, and he was a very sort of sickly, pathetic sort of young kid with a rotten background.
This is a kid who would be woken up and told to clean up bloodstains in the house where there'd been a murder at the age of 12 or 13, who had firearms hidden in his bedroom.
He was known to talk under a little bit of pressure. He came into police custody, into witness protection, and he had interview after interview. And each interview, his involvement got more complex.
Whilst Ryan was quick to tell what he knew about the shootings, the problem for police was that his account kept changing every time he spoke to the detectives.
Is what you've told us today the truth about what happened at Wall Street?
Yep. So he'd gone from hearing something in his mother's flat, which was probably very interesting for us. He then put himself at the crime scene, told of who killed the police and how it actually happened, what guns were used.
On the 31st of October 1988, Ryan was charged with murder for his involvement in the Wall Street shootings and was bailed into police protective custody. Police hoped that the mounting pressure on the young gangster would lead to him providing yet more information. A similar tactic was used on another figure on the periphery of the gang, 20-year-old Anthony Farrell.
Anthony Farrell, again, was a well-known criminal, but on a smaller scale than the others. He certainly wasn't a member of the Flemington Crew. He was a drug taker, more of a small-time thief.
Anthony Farrell was a young boy mixing with older criminals. He came from a family that was had some criminal associates, and he got himself caught up in something that was probably well beyond him.
Jason Ryan claimed that Farrell was involved in the planning of the shootings. Thinking that it would intensify pressure on the youngster to talk, police charged Anthony Farrell with murder. Ryan would go on to name another 4 members of the Flemington Crew he claimed were directly involved in the shooting of Tynan and Eyre.
Jason Ryan took us down to Wall Street. We did a number of reenactments with him where he would tell us certain things that turned out to be untrue. So anything he told us, we would want to corroborate. Over a period of time, he finally gave us a version that we believe to be the correct version, involving Peter McAvoy, Victor Pearce, Jed Horton, Anthony Farrell, and to a lesser degree, Trevor Pettingill. He told us that they had been the ones involved in murdering Steve Tynan and Damien Eyre.
And what was the plan by everyone when you came here?
Come here to ambush the police.
Victor Pearce was the main offender out of the Flemington crew. He was the leader of the group, he was the planner, the organiser, and the mainstay of that group.
With Jason Ryan naming the alleged perpetrators in the plot, 5 men became suspects in the killings. Victor Pearce, Peter McAvoy, Jed Horton, Trevor Pettingill, and Anthony Farrell.
I'm innocent. I'm not guilty of these charges. I've done nothing wrong. I do not carry guns when I report to police stations.
Although he was cooperating with the police, doubt remained over the value of Jason Ryan's statement. After all, he told detectives several versions of his story. Within the ranks of the task force, there were concerns that a jury simply wouldn't believe him. But in November 1988, as police continued to assemble their case, their investigation was rocked by news of more shootings.
Nicole? 350, 2 members down, urgent.
With Melbourne still reeling from the brutal murders of 2 young police officers on Wall Street in October 1988, the task force formed to identify the killers were desperate to find the missing pieces of the puzzle that would lead to convictions. 5 men, Victor Pearce, Peter McAvoy, Anthony Farrell, Trevor Pettingill, and Jed Horton were the prime suspects in the murders. Horton was a violent bank robber, and police were convinced he had a major role in the murders. But he had disappeared. When police tracked him down to a caravan park a month after the shootings, they moved in to arrest him.
He'd been hiding out in Bendigo. He'd still been active in his armed robberies right up until Wall Street. He had 7 firearms in the caravan at the time the police tried to effect the arrest.
He raised a weapon, tried to shoot the SWAT guys coming in through the door. Shots were fired. All the shots that were fired were police rounds. Jed Horton was shot dead.
That killing caused further resentment and anger in the underworld, who thought that it was just a way of levelling the score.
There was controversy in the killing of Jed Horton, absolute controversy. Front page news all around Australia. Police kill another one. And it was controversy that I guess that in hindsight, it was warranted. Everyone went out in open arms, screaming and yelling abuse at the police. It was probably the most heated part of the entire investigation was the killing of Jed Horton. But there was worse to come. There was one more shooting, and that was Gary Abdallah.
Gary Abdallah was a known associate of the Flemington crew, a convicted car thief who police believed had also been involved in bank robberies. In his statement, Jason Ryan had implicated Abdallah, claiming the 24-year-old father of one actually provided the getaway vehicle on the night of the shootings.
We believed that he had critical information that could certainly involve Victor Pearce, Peter McAvoy, Jed Horton in particular, and that he had supplied a getaway vehicle for them.
With the police activity intensifying, Abdallah went to ground. He was eventually traced by the Wall Street detectives, but his interview yielded no clues. 2 months later, Gary Abdallah was shot and critically wounded by police.
He was arrested by police not connected with the Wall Street Task Force. He was taken back to his flat. They would give sworn evidence that he produced what they thought was a firearm and pointed it at the police. One of the police then emptied his 6-shot Smith & Wesson revolver and then grabbed his colleagues and fired another shot. Abdallah suffered fatal injuries. He lived for a number of days before he died. The firearm that Abdallah is alleged to have pointed at the police was a replica. It wasn't a real gun. So there was much angst over this. Why would someone do that?
For the task force, Gary Abdallah's death meant another potential source of information about the Wall Street murders was lost. Despite the confidence in their case against the remaining suspects, police were desperate for another source of information that would help secure a conviction. They would find it in the most unlikely of places.
Just for the record, could you just please state your full name?
Wendy Margaret Pearce.
Wendy Pearce was the wife of Victor Pearce. She'd been a member of the family for a long time. She was certainly an avid supporter of the Flemington crew. She certainly assisted in the preparation of many of their offences. She enjoyed the spoils of what they did.
She lived the life of a gangster's wife. He committed armed robberies. He went to work like you and I. Every morning he'd get up and he'd go out, and it would be, today might be surveillance of banks. Tomorrow might be getting firearms, and Thursday might be actually doing the job. And she would cook tea and he'd come home and he would confide.
She was considered to be an incredibly valuable person to us. If we could roll her over, she would have been, without doubt, the best Crown witness or the best rollover witness we could ever hope for.
Wendy Pearce's life was crashing down. Her husband Victor was now one of the prime suspects in the Wall Street murder case, and he was facing years in prison for other armed robbery offences. Sensing she could be exploited, police tried to persuade her to turn against her husband and his gang.
Her husband was jailed. She found it really hard to live by herself. Police started raiding her house again and again and again. She got into a fight and spent 10 weeks into jail. Her husband was locked up. Her house had been taken by police, and she was very vulnerable. And at that point, police started talking to her.
That no one's forced you to...
No, I'm here on my own freedom.
Come with us.
Yes.
Wendy Pearce made the approach to the task force. She was prepared to talk and did tell exactly what happened the night of Graham Jensen, the discussions, the reaction by Victor and other criminals that she was aware of to the news that Graham had been killed. She was aware of the discussions in regard to the payback. She was with Victor that night. She was able to give evidence of Victor leaving and returning some early hours of the morning after the shooting of Steve Tynan and Damien Eyre.
I've been married to Victor for 13 years. I've always been an alibi for Victor.
So Cole McLaren was central to Wendy Pearce becoming a Crown witness and giving evidence. He worked and worked and worked on Wendy and was the one who convinced her to come over and give evidence.
But she wasn't falling off the edge just yet. She needed another little bit of a push. I found some love letters between Victor and one of her friends to show that Victor had been unfaithful to her. So she was livid and she was on the edge. We had her on the edge of rolling over.
Someone saw Wendy talking to detectives, and that put Wendy at risk. And she came very close to, she believes, and police believe, being killed with a hot shot of drugs.
I rang Wendy and she answered the phone and she's all blurry and she just kept saying, "Help, help, McLaren, help, help, help me." Straight away I knew we had trouble, and then the phone went dead. I told my boss, David Sprague. He flew over there with other detectives and an ambulance. She was found with remnants of a syringe and she was under the influence of high potent heroin.
Police managed to get her before she died and started to put her into witness protection and talk about her giving evidence against her family, her husband's friends. And at a point in that journey, she made a decision to turn and to talk.
Finally, she made a statement of 31 pages where she actually identified Victor as the main perpetrator of Wall Street. She became the star witness.
I made that statement because I was scared, because if I didn't, Victor would kill me. He would have killed me.
So what are you saying? You lied and you supplied Victor George Pearce with an alibi that night when in actual fact the truth is different.
Yeah.
She told this vivid story about how her husband, how Victor had said he was going to kill 2 cops because of Jensen.
Right. What is the truth?
The truth is, Victor did get out of bed that night. He did leave the motel. I heard him go and I heard him come back.
She said that Victor had gone out that night, later returned and was cold, and I think there was some evidence she gave that he'd said that he'd whacked the jacks.
Victor got up and I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to make macaroni to knock the jacks and kill Graham.
Which is our young boys, of course, Tynan and Air. So she was incredibly valuable to us. She was, unlike Jason Ryan, our ticket to success on this. We had to preserve her, we had to look after her and make sure we held on to her all the way to the trial. We had the wife of one of the key killers here who was telling us the facts.
By July 1990, police had amassed enough evidence to charge 4 men with the Wall Street killings. Peter McAvoy, Victor Pearce, Trevor Pettingill and Anthony Farrell would face justice in court. Confident that in Wendy Pearce the task force had a witness that would make for a cast-iron case, the police began preparing for the trial in Melbourne's Supreme Court. Little did they know that the day before the trial, their case would come crashing down. The Thai Air Task Force had been assembled in the wake of the cold-blooded shooting of 2 young police officers, Constable Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre. As 1990 came to an end, and with court proceedings looming, the detectives on the task force were about to find out if almost 2 years of hard work had been worth it.
We had a good, strong prosecution case, but you can never tell until the trial exactly what's going to happen. So we never got ahead of ourselves.
The case largely relied on evidence from 2 key individuals who had given statements to the police. The first, Jason Ryan, was a young gangster who told police various versions of what he thought happened on the night of the killings. He had initially been charged with murder, but those charges were withdrawn 10 weeks before the committal hearing. There was a real concern within the task force about how the young criminal would be viewed by a jury. The second crucial witness was Wendy Pearce, the wife of Victor Pearce, the man police believed was the leader of the gang responsible for the killings.
When Wendy first started talking to police, before she really spilled the beans, police worked deliberately to butter her up, to be nice to her. They gave her nice hotels, they looked after her, they treated her, spoiled her a bit.
They went on boat trips, yacht trips out on the bay. It was a really nice life. Wendy liked it. She actually became very affectionate with at least one of the police. And she felt like very special. But ultimately, with witness protection in those days, it's not Acapulco where you end up. It's public housing in a pretty dreary sort of life. And I don't think Wendy was really looking forward to being yesterday's flavour of the month. Meanwhile, Victor and the family, through third parties, were just getting to her all the time saying, it's okay, you can come back.
She wasn't under constant surveillance, she wasn't under constant care by the police. The police gave her far too much latitude. So she was able to make calls, she was able to go visiting people, have people visit her.
She gave evidence at the committal and she starred. She went straight through it. She stuck to her story. The police were really confident. And then comes the pre-trial argument. She gets up and says it's all a lie. Victor didn't do it.
She walked in, told Justice Vincent nothing, said she wasn't going to offer any evidence.
My husband's in it and it's all I've got to say, okay?
And it was all over.
It was devastating.
Wendy Pearce had spent 18 months in witness protection at a cost of around $2 million. Now, her statements were worthless.
There was a strong move to put her in the box and make her a hostile witness. The prosecutor refused to do it, so she didn't give evidence.
I don't know why Wendy essentially turned the way she did. I suspect someone got a message to her from her husband saying that she'd been forgiven, and she accepted that. And certainly after the case, they got back together. So she trusted her instinct, and she got away with it.
Whatever the reason for Wendy Pearce's change of heart, the Crown's case was fatally compromised.
Without Wendy Pearce, we had nothing but a lying, conniving Jason Ryan.
Without her testimony, and with Jason Ryan's evidence being found to be at least flawed, the case was wounded.
All that work, 2.5 years of absolute solid work, down the drain because we mishandled the most important witness we could have ever hoped for. It was without doubt the worst day of my police career.
Despite the damning U-turn, police and prosecutors had little option other than to proceed with the case. In a trial that lasted 7 weeks, it was clear that for the Crown at least, it had started to go wrong even before the jury was sworn in.
The prosecution case was holed below the waterline. From then on, it became frantic to bail and bail to try and keep afloat.
The police hopes lay with Jason Ryan as a witness. But the great problem was here with him was, which story did you believe? The first, the second, the third? And I think it was summed up in one beautiful exchange in court where he was asked whether his name was Jason Ryan, and he had to admit it wasn't. His real name's Jason Brooks. The lies just built on the lies that built on the lies.
The four accused, Victor Pearce, Peter McAvoy, Trevor Pettingill and Anthony Farrell, opted to give unsworn evidence. They would be asked questions by their own legal team, but wouldn't face cross-examination. Predictably, they all denied any involvement in the killings. On the morning of the 26th of March 1991, the jury reached a verdict.
The jury deliberated for about 6 days before returning their verdicts. They found each of the four not guilty of the murders of Tynan and Eyre.
I'm on top of the world, on you lot.
When I heard that those 4 persons had been acquitted of that murder, I was very, very pissed off. And it's only because of the lies that were told. Doesn't matter how good your investigators are and how good a job they do, there's always these little things that can happen.
I can remember coming out of the court, but I can remember standing on the steps and saying there's a higher justice, and I just knew it. I mean, these are 2 young men, wonderful young men that had 50 years maybe in front of them, and someone can just go out and do that and get away with it, obviously. How can you feel?
Steve Tynan and Damien Eyre deserve better than that. The families deserve better than that. The community deserve better than that. We all know what happened, but we didn't prove that beyond reasonable doubt in the jury's mind.
When the verdict was announced, the accused were yelling from the dock, and particularly loudmouth Gutless McAvoy was up there yelling abuse.
To give you an idea of the emotions, that when the word came out that there was an acquittal, D24 sent a message to all units.
Announcement to all units, the verdict in the Wall Street trial was all 4 not guilty, repeat, not guilty. All units are warned, keep yourselves in control.
They never found them innocent, they just found them not guilty. That meant in their minds there wasn't sufficient evidence to find them guilty.
In December 1992, Wendy Pearce was found guilty of perjury after backtracking on her statement. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison.
The only great pleasure I had was actually doing the brief of evidence against her for perjury and having her convicted of probably the worst case of perjury in the state of Victoria.
In July 1993, just over 2 years after the end of the Wall Street trial, 5 Victoria police officers were charged with murdering Graham Jensen. Only one of those cases made it to trial. The officer was found not guilty after the jury deliberated for just 20 minutes. But for another character in the Wall Street story, fate had a different outcome in store. On the 1st of May 2002, police responded to reports of a shooting on Bay Street in Port Melbourne. The victim had been gunned down in his car. His name was Victor Pearce.
If there is such a thing as karma, it certainly caught up with Victor Pearce because he was murdered sitting in a Commodore, ambushed.
It was believed he'd been the murderer of a mafia drug dealer, which was in fact incorrect. He hadn't done that murder at all, but was murdered in reprisal for that murder. So, lived by the sword, died by the sword. It was probably a just and fair outcome for him.
Following Pearce's death, his wife Wendy made a startling admission to journalist John Sylvester, where she once again changed her story. In 2005, she claimed that her husband Victor had been involved in the murders.
She said Victor Pearce was the organiser, and she implicated the others who'd been acquitted as the co-offenders.
Wendy Pearce alleged the Wall Street killers were her husband Victor, Peter McAvoy, and Jed Horton, who was later shot by the police. She also claimed Gary Abdallah was the person who stole the car that was abandoned in Wall Street. Of course, her allegations remain just that. Peter McAvoy lives in New South Wales, and his not guilty verdict stands. For the families of the fallen officers, Wendy Pearce's allegations were of little comfort. They still feel only a coroner's inquest would satisfy their need for answers.
There's nothing on the government records to say how they were killed because there's been no inquest. So there's nothing there. There's just 2 members of the police force shot dead in Wall Street. And I know who done it. And I want an answer.
"30 years after the murders of Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre, the shots fired on Wall Street in October 1988 still echo throughout the entire police force.
I think the names Tynan and Eyre to Victorian policemen mean it could be me.
Wall Street is a stain on the history of the Victoria Police. Not only was it a reprehensible ambush of 2 police, but ultimately there was no conviction, so 4 people got away with murder.
Wall Street was one of the worst crimes Australia's ever had, no doubt. It was also probably one that left more scars internally than externally. The criminal world just marched on, got over it. Within the police department, we still have scars, we still have wounds that still fester. Sadly, this story is always remembered about the squabbles between the armed robbery squad and the underworld. And that's not right. It should be all about the loss of 2 young boys, the loss of innocence, the loss of Constables Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre. Let's spare a thought for them.
September 2012 in Melbourne. A 29-year-old woman disappears while walking home after a night out.
The CCTV footage showed a man talking with her on the street. At once, everybody needed to know, who is this man in the blue hoodie?
Investigations would uncover the secrets of a violent murderer.
Police officers said that they were looking at a potential serial killer.
He didn't actually look at first glance like an evil monster that he plainly was.
And flaws in the Australian parole system were exposed.
Had our justice system worked better, she'd be alive today.
The murder of Jill Marr was a crime that shook Australia.
Brunswick's an eclectic place. It's full of bars. It's got the longest shopping strip in Australia, which is Sydney Road. It's a very hipster area, and every city's got one, and it's where the arts community really is.
There's a lot of little bars there. It's very trendy. You go there, you have a drink on a Friday night or a Saturday night, and you enjoy yourself. No one's thinking about their safety in a big way in Melbourne generally.
One weekend in September 2012, the sense of normality was rocked by a cruel and brutal act of violence. The perpetrator was a softly spoken predator, and his target was an innocent woman called Jill Marr. Originally from Ireland, Jill lived in Melbourne and worked at the ABC.
September the 21st was just a normal Melbourne night. It's a really gregarious city. A lot of us go out after work on a Friday night.
For Jill, it sounded like another Friday night. She was going out for drinks with work colleagues. She finished work about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She went out with some workmates.
They were seen walking down South Bank on CCTV. She has a drink in the city, and then afterwards she heads out to close to where she lives on Sydney Road to a place called the Brunswick Green.
She's carried on through the night, had some more drinks, and then later in the evening ended up at Bar Etiquette, where she had a few more drinks.
Bar Etiquette was only around 900 metres from the apartment Jill shared with her husband, Tom.
Now that worked for her in a practical sense because it was very close to home. And at a certain point she actually contacted Tom and suggested that he come down. At that stage I think he was asleep on the couch and missed the message. When the bar closed at 1:30, she headed off home.
So she leaves with a colleague from Bar Etiquette, and he goes to get a cab, and he tries to talk her into getting into the cab and giving her a lift home, which is very close. It's less than a kilometre from that bar. But she doesn't want it, she wants to walk home. So they a kiss on the cheek, and he gets in the cab, and then from there she's on her own, and that's where she starts walking up Sydney Road.
This seemingly minor decision would go on to have devastating consequences.
Jill left the bar about 1:30 a.m. At 2 a.m, Tom tried to call her, didn't get in contact with her. Tom sent some text messages after that, trying to contact her.
Well, I think it's really confusing for Tom that he can't get a text back. Her walk is really close. She would have made that walk many, many times before. And even though it's dark in spots, she wouldn't have felt that anything was going to happen to her.
At 4 a.m, he was so concerned that he actually left where they lived and started walking the streets trying to find Jill. By 6 a.m, he was so concerned he contacted the police to report her missing.
When a person's reported missing to the local police, and that's where it basically starts, it goes to the uniform branch. So you walk into the police station, there's a uniformed person there, and I want to report a missing person. They'll take details of description, any photograph, where this person may or may not have been, to get as much information about this particular person. It's then assessed by the uniformed people and then escalated to the detectives in the same police station. They again do an assessment, and then they would have begun their search of tracing where she may have been and may not have been. So that would have stayed at, well, I would say, local level, because we get so many missing persons reports given to the police.
From the time that Tom reports his wife missing, there's a missing report go in. There's some inquiries. They look up things like has she used her bank card, all those sorts of things, and they don't find any sign of what's happened to Jill.
Through the day on the Saturday, Tom contacted the people that Jill had been drinking with to find out her movements late on that Friday night. He rang around as much as he could to find out where Jill had been and what she had been doing, and the word of mouth spread very quickly. The police made inquiries. They followed the usual protocols on this sort of thing to try and find out what they were dealing with through the course of that Saturday.
By the Sunday, there's a Facebook page that's gone up. There's also the starts of Twitter, social media activity, and that's when we really find out there's someone missing, and that's when the media get interested, and there's a press conference on the Sunday, a very small one at that stage, about a missing woman named Jill Marr.
Hope somebody needs to stop something, or she just walked through the door. Do you still think that'll, could happen today? That she...
They have to. Yeah.
And we're hopeful for the best, obviously, but we have some concerns that she may have met with foul play.
Within days, a Facebook group called Help Us Find Jill Maher had attracted 100,000 likes. It was a situation where the power of social media was shown up sort of in its greatness, I suppose. Tom sort of used it and applied it very, very readily to try and get to the bottom of what had happened straight away. And at the same time, obviously, the police were going through their inquiries as well and going through what they always do in these sorts of situations. And the media as well, we jumped on the story very, very quickly on the Sunday.
It's been a really difficult time for us because Jill is part of our ABC family and she's a very highly valued member. She's a great admin professional and we rely on her every day.
It was something that just gripped Melbourne very, very quickly. By that Sunday night, everyone was wondering, where is Jill Maher?
In the early hours of Saturday the 22nd of September 2012, a young woman called Jill Maher left a bar on Sydney Road in the Melbourne suburb of Brunswick and disappeared.
Jill Maher was someone who was larger than life. She was very popular with her work colleagues at the ABC. She liked to have fun. Her mother described her as messy and goofy. She was somebody who made other people happy just with her presence.
Jill left Bar Etiquette at around 1:30 a.m. to walk the short distance to her flat. She never arrived. Her frantic husband, Tom, reported her missing at 6 a.m. the following morning, and police began searching the area. There then followed a social media frenzy, offering help and demanding information.
The response from the public was quite overwhelming once it was put out there in the media. I suppose it would have helped the fact that she was part of the media herself, working for ABC. Not that it would have made any difference because it's what the media would then pick up and then put out there. She was a very attractive lady, a young lady, and it's something that we've all done, as we all should be able to do, is walk the streets of anywhere late at night and feel quite safe.
It didn't make sense. He was this vivacious, lovely girl who was on a short walk home from the bar to her home. He was her very, very concerned husband who had presented himself to the media, to the police. He was plainly very, very upset. There was this great confusion because nobody could understand where she was. Tom seemed very transparent in his concerns, and nobody wanted to believe that the most sinister scenario, that perhaps something, perhaps she had met foul play on this very, very short walk between the bar to her home.
I don't remember seeing anything about Tom being accused of anything at that point, but certainly by the Monday morning, he makes an appeal to the press, in this time in a media scrum, for any information about his wife.
Tom, what are you going through?
Hell. It's just devastating, but just trying to push on.
At this stage, the homicide squad is investigating, and that's when you start to wonder what's going on with the husband. Where was the husband? And you start looking for answers.
What the police did was obviously look at those people who are closest to Jill first, because quite often that's the situation in disappearances, is that somebody close to the victim is somehow involved. So they went to Jill and Tom's home, they searched that, they went and searched the car that they owned, and this was all filmed by the media and sort of obviously broadcast.
They had to eliminate Tom as a person of interest. So unfortunately his flat was searched. The investigators don't know whether she was killed there and a body dumped and he's made a ruse. So the car becomes important as he transported the body somewhere. So they need to cover all of those. Whilst it's difficult in the early stages, that people will look at the husband, the father, the wife, whoever else is close to the missing person, they become that focal point. But in the long run, investigators can then say, if it's unsolved, we've looked at the husband, we've looked at the wife or the father, whoever it may well be, and we are more than satisfied that they are not involved in this particular missing person. So you start at the basics, eliminate them as persons of interest, be confident in yourself, and we can start looking elsewhere.
My colleague had interviewed him and he was certain that he had nothing to do with it. So we were relatively certain, without absolutely knowing, that he had no part in this and that he was looking for his wife, that he was devastated that his wife was not there. His fear in his eyes that something terribly, terribly wrong had happened.
Although the court of public opinion was largely on Tom's side, police couldn't rule him out of their inquiries completely. But that began to change when a trawl of CCTV cameras in the area where Jill was last seen turned up a vital clue.
It was critical that there be some sighting of Jill Meagher before she goes missing. From the moment that she's left bar etiquette to the moment that she's trying to get home. Where is she? Her colleague knows that she's walked along Sydney Road and we don't know anything else.
Ultimately, investigators wanted to try and retrace where Jill would have been. They would have been aware that she was at a local bar, so they'll be looking at getting CCTV from there. Has she left with someone? Has someone followed her out of the bar? And you start working your way back from there. Then they would have been walking along the route she would have taken, walking back home, and you are looking for CCTV cameras. And as luck had it, there was a number of CCTV cameras in the stores along her route, which they then were able to retrieve, which had that identification of Jill walking up, and within seconds after that you see a male person running after her.
You see a man walking from the left side to the right side and he's wearing a blue hoodie. And then a little bit later, you see Jill Meagher come into the picture and she's approached by the man in the blue hoodie and they seem to talk. You don't think by looking at it that they know each other, but they might. She then takes her mobile phone out. She just seems a bit bothered by this person and then you see them walk away from left side.
Again, a major breakthrough. But again, what do you read into that? The fact that it's there is that someone she knew, that she happened to recognise in the street. But that's all we've got to go on. So we start working on that, we get a description. We can't identify this person. Who is this person? And what's happened after they've gone out of frame? Because it shows Jill Meagher alive and well at a particular time. And that's your starting point. Who is this man that actually was seen running after her? Is this the offender we're looking at? So that's a major starting point for the investigators and very, very significant. And then they've got to look at, do we release it to the media to try and get the public on board to assist the investigators?
The CCTV footage changed the whole nature of the investigation. It showed that Jill did interact with other people on the way home. It also showed that she did leave the bar and probably intend to walk straight home because it was on the way home, the bridal shop from which the footage came from. It showed a man in a blue hoodie. He became the blue hoodie man. And at once, everybody needed to know, who is this man in the blue hoodie? It changed everything. He became, from that moment that footage was aired, he became the likely man of interest that everybody wanted to know about. What did he know, and did he have something to do with her disappearance?
As police scoured hours of CCTV footage for more glimpses of Jill, other detectives have been searching the surrounding area for more clues.
Police initially searched the area around the laneway off Hope Street in Brunswick and didn't find much of much note. They subsequently searched it again, I think, on the Monday morning, and they found Jill's handbag, which contained a lot of items, including her ABC ID badge.
Convinced that Jill's handbag, found in the alley, would lead to the killer, police were keen to understand how it had suddenly reappeared near the location of her last known sighting.
Now that was a turn up because that handbag wasn't there on the initial search. That prompted all sorts of speculations because police wondered, how did this handbag get placed back in this search area when it wasn't there previously.
Tragically, what seemed like a clue turned out to be a red herring. A local resident had spotted Jill's handbag in the alley and taken it home. But then, spooked by all the news coverage, he'd returned the bag to where he'd found it the following day, where it was discovered by police. What the bag did prove, however, was that Jill's disappearance was becoming more suspicious.
I think some people feared the worst from the start, and I think when people accepted that Tom's story was very sincere, people started to wonder what the hell had happened. As the week proceeded and no information was forthcoming about Jill's whereabouts, I think a lot of people began to fear the worst.
Once they've got the bag and once they've got the CCTV, there's very little doubt in investigators' mind, and I think anyone who was close to the case as a journalist or anyone watching it very closely thought there's something very wrong, because it's not like someone like Jill Meagher to just disappear. And the other thing is she's not using her phone and she's not using her bank cards or bank accounts. So we go to someone that's probably met with foul play very quickly in this scenario.
In an effort to move the investigation forward, detectives turned to technology.
The investigators would have been looking at Jill's phone, her mobile phone. Has she made calls? When she made calls? Is it still operative and what's happening with it? Can we identify the location of it? The amount of phones were bouncing off the same tower at that particular time. There would have been hundreds upon hundreds at that particular night of a Friday night, early hours of Saturday morning. It's painstaking work, but you've got to go through it. No one's going to come and hand you over the evidence. You've got to find it as investigators. And investigators are driven by getting the family's answers.
What they discovered was that her mobile phone was in Brunswick until about 4:30 a.m. Now, they looked at where her mobile phone went after that time, and it travelled northwards, probably along the Tullamarine Freeway.
At that stage, the investigators were able to cross-reference the time of her phone pinging off a tower at Moreland Road to all cars going under the gantry along the Tullamarine Freeway, the gantry being the toll point, which photographs motor cars.
And what they discovered by going through those number plates on those cars was that a well-known sex offender owned one of those cars that had gone through the gantry at about the same time that Jill's mobile phone started moving northwards. And so they tracked it back from there and came up with the name of Adrian Bailey.
The mobile phone signal had been linked to a dangerous sex offender. The pressure was now on to track him down. With Jill Meagher now missing for almost a week, detectives were keen to make an arrest and finally find an answer to the question, what had happened to her? Police investigating the disappearance of Melbourne woman Jill Meagher linked her mobile phone data to the movements of a local sex offender, 41-year-old Adrian Bailey. Following the identification of his vehicle, police tracked Bailey down and began to question him.
Adrian Bailey underwent what became a 10-hour interview with police. Now, for most of that 10 hours, he denied any involvement or any encounter. His starting point was that he knew nothing and had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of Jill Meagher, but that he had heard about it in news reports. And that's all he knew about it.
While police were interviewing Adrian Bailey, police were searching his house at the same time, and that's when they found Jill Meagher's SIM card.
The SIM card had turned up in Adrian Bailey's washing while his then girlfriend, was washing his clothes.
And that was the crucial bit of evidence that linked him to Jill Meagher.
That would have been the most significant breakthrough for investigators. The fact is, you need to tie a potential suspect to a missing person, and this gave investigators that strong link. How else does Jill's SIM card from her phone get into the property in the private home of Adrian Bailey? There's got to be no other explanation, but the fact is, he is involved with this lady's disappearance.
Bailey had a way with police interviews where he would always deny for hundreds and hundreds of questions, and at a certain point he would break. Hours and hours into the interview process, he turned basically and said, yes, I'm responsible. Yes, I feel very bad about it. I wish it hadn't happened. This happened about 6 or 7 hours into the process with Jill Meagher. And at that point, he became very forthcoming.
Through some persuasion, he was then able to give some definition around what he'd done, which is how he ended up in a laneway off Hope Street and how he had raped and murdered Jill Meagher.
He admitted to talking to Jill Meagher. He claimed that he was trying to be nice to her, that she'd been on the phone to her brother or to family, as far as he knew, and that he was trying to be nice. He was trying to have a conversation with her, and that she had initially been nice and that she had then turned nasty. I think he talked about her flipping him off. Now, her flipping him off had sort of made him very angry, and that had sort of subsequently led to his outburst of violence, which had led to her death.
After Bailey killed Meagher, he went home, got his car, and then drove back to retrieve the body.
He had put her in the boot of his car, driven her along the Calder Highway to a place called Gisborne South in a dirt road, and he had buried her in a shallow grave at that site.
To me, this shows a lot of planning, a very solid attempt to avoid detection with a view to protecting his own interests.
So police were able to get him into a police car. He was going to help them to locate the body, and they went up a lot of wrong alleys and roads trying to find where Jill Meagher's body was. But they get to Black Hill Road, and it's at that point that he starts to realise where he is, and he tells them to suddenly stop, and he points over towards a site which he doesn't want to go to, and he becomes fairly agitated. That's where they found Jill Meagher's body.
Jill's body was discovered partially naked from the waist down in a grave that was only 35 centimetres deep. Post-mortem results revealed that after being violently raped, she was strangled to death by Bailey.
There's been no greater outpouring of emotion in Melbourne than this case and the death of Jill Meagher. On the following day, after all of the police interviews, on the Sunday, 30,000 people marched along Sydney Road, the last place where Jill Meagher was seen, as an outpouring of not only grief, but as a protest that things had to change and that people had to be protected from people like Adrian Bailey.
That same night that Jill Meagher was found, an out-of-sessions court was held where Adrian Bailey was charged with murder. So by the next morning, that news had spread all across Melbourne, the worst kind of news, that Jill Meagher was dead.
News with Peter Hitchner.
Today's developments followed a dramatic arrest and the discovery of Jill Meagher's body in a shallow grave northwest of Melbourne.
A devastating discovery marking the end to a story all of Melbourne had been hoping would have a happy ending.
Now, what happened with that is that social media and the internet went wild because the interest had been so intense. Adrian Bailey's name was all across the internet, and there was a great outpouring, not just of grief, but of anger towards this man who had done something so horrible to such an innocent victim. Now that would have consequences down the track in terms of his charging and the judicial process, because once he is charged, evil or not, he's still entitled to a fair trial, and so this outpouring simply couldn't happen.
Whilst you can't stop people doing it, you can try and plead with people, please do not put this stuff out on social media. Once a person's been charged, they're entitled to a fair trial. It is the courts that must identify innocence or guilt, not you, the community, not you, the investigators, but it's the courts. Investigators collect the facts, present them to the court, and at the point of a person being charged, that's when all media and all social media should stop and wait till this person gets a fair trial.
This was such a serious concern at the time that the then Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, Ken Lay, asked people to stop posting these sorts of messages online because it would have potentially such dire consequences.
Frustratingly for journalists and reporters, their coverage of the case was restricted, but that didn't stop them delving into the background of Adrian Bailey to try and find information that could be used when the court proceedings allowed. What they would uncover was a man with a history of violence towards women that would defy comprehension.
Adrian Bailey was born in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. He grew up there, played footy. He was a non-event. He was known to be a little bit of a loner. I don't think he had a lot of close friends.
He was off the radar until the age of 18 when he married his first wife and she became pregnant, and it was at that stage that he first came to police attention. At the age of 18, he raped a friend of his sister's who was 17 at the time. He then subsequently attacked and attempted to rape another 17-year-old and then a 16-year-old. At that point, he was arrested and questioned at great length. He consequently confessed to those crimes and was charged.
He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in jail, but he only served 22 months of that term before he's paroled.
I saw Adrian Bailey in 1991. He was a teenager, he was charged with serious sexual offences, and he went to court. I prepared a report for the court, and that evidence was publicly led, and he was sentenced according to law. So in his case, he was not mad, he was bad. My recommendations inevitably would have been that he required treatment and monitoring. Given his age, I think he was about 18 at the time, I would have been perhaps more optimistic in terms of his prognosis than if I'd seen him as an older man.
Bailey would go on to have 2 children with his first wife before they divorced in 1995. He remarried later that year and went on to have another 2 children before that marriage also broke down.
For reasons we don't know, Adrian Bailey seemed to stay off the police radar for 6 or 7 years until 2000, when he started attacking sex workers in the St Kilda area. Between 2000 and 2001, he's known to have attacked 5 sex workers. His attacks all followed a very, very similar pattern. Each of those victims described a very, very similar means of attack. Due to some very good policing by St Kilda detectives who pieced together these rapes on these sex workers, he was eventually identified and questioned and interviewed at great length in about 2001. He confessed to those attacks. He told detectives that he considered the victims worthless. He said that he wasn't getting much sex at home at the time, and that motivated the attacks. He was subsequently charged with 16 counts of rape, and he was eventually convicted and sentenced to 8 years of non-parole. I think it was an 11-year full sentence.
Parole is the conditional release of a prisoner into the community at a point of time either at the end of the prisoner's non-parole period or after that date has been reached and prior to the expiration of his actual sentence. In the case of Adrian Bailey, in 2002, he was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 8 years for multiple rapes on multiple complainants. The 8 years was the non-parole period. He could not be released on parole until after he had served that time, which in fact is what happened. He then was released on parole in 2010.
What happened next would shock the Australian public and the justice system to its core.
One of the saddest things about this entire case is that Adrian Bailey shouldn't have been on the streets when he attacked Jill Meagher. He was on parole and he'd breached that parole months and months earlier when he attacked a man in Geelong outside a cafe, breaking his jaw. He pleaded guilty to that, but he didn't like the sentence that he was given and appealed it. For some strange reason, the parole board didn't put him back in prison because they allowed him to remain out on bail while his appeal was going through the courts.
The bottom line here is, had our justice system worked better, he wouldn't have been out in the streets and Jill Meagher would be alive today.
The brutal death of Jill Meagher in 2012 shocked not only Melbourne, but the entire country. The man responsible, Adrian Bailey, a convicted sex offender, was charged with murder. In March 2013, he entered a plea of guilty to 1 count of rape, but he denied the murder charge. Then, in a dramatic U-turn, he changed that plea to guilty, admitting that he was in fact a killer.
I was there in the court on the day that Adrian Bailey pleaded guilty. He's a short man, very unprepossessing. He's got his sandy hair, a pockmarked face, a certain vanity about him. Whenever the juries walked into the room, he would straighten his tie and inflate his chest. Fairly softly spoken, and that was the striking thing about him. He could actually present as a very average, normal sort of human being. He didn't actually look at first glance like an evil monster that he plainly was. He actually just looked like another bloke in the room.
Justice Nettle sentenced Bailey to life imprisonment with a 35-year non-parole period for the murder of Jill Maher.
He said in sentencing that if Bailey hadn't pleaded guilty, he would have given him a life term without any possibility of parole, which probably reflected community sentiment at the time. There are worse crimes, believe it or not, but none of them have touched people in quite the horrible way that Jill's death did.
Police officers said that they were looking at a potential serial killer, or what they termed someone who would definitely become a serial killer.
Adrian Bailey is a monster. He set out to hunt and to hurt women for most of his adult life, and he belongs in a cage.
Present for the sentencing were Jill's loved ones.
From day one, you look back at how Jill's husband presented himself, how he was entirely transparent, he was very honest in how he felt. His grief was on public display. He was going through the most horrible thing he will ever go through, and he was very frank about it. He was very grateful for those who helped him. But that extended throughout the entire family, throughout the process. On the day that Bailey was sentenced, Jill's father came out in front of the court and gave a very simple and heartfelt thank you to both the police and the prosecutors for ensuring that justice had been done.
Jill lived a life full of family, friends, and her beloved Tom. Jill was brutally raped and murdered and is never coming back.
Jill's family throughout the entire ordeal has been marked by this incredible dignity. They sort of stood almost as the polar opposite to the man who had done such a terrible thing.
I've been really humbled by the support of the Australian public, the tireless efforts of the police and all the friends and family who've put their lives on hold to help us out.
As the legal proceedings drew to a close, the awful truth about Bailey's past crimes was finally able to be publicised. Following relentless media coverage, the trial and the revelations about the killer, even more victims came to light. Bailey had already been convicted of 16 counts of rape between the years 2000 and 2001. And now, following his murder trial, 3 more women came forward and accused him of rape. Cases that would eventually see Adrian Bailey back in court. The first was an 18-year-old sex worker from St Kilda who claimed that in the year 2000, Bailey attacked her.
She claimed that she was on her 3rd job at the time, and she happened to be reading what was known as an ugly mug report, which was something that the sex workers circulated to protect themselves from the nasty clients at the time. And she was literally reading this report when Adrian Bailey pulled over, looking for her services, basically.
She got into Adrian Bailey's car and she commented that there's a lot of bad guys that are in these streets, and he replied, "I'm one of those bad guys." And it was only years later, after the Jill Maher case, that she saw his face again and reported it to police.
Unfortunately, the woman's evidence in the later trial was questioned, and her identification of Bailey was found to be unreliable. In April 2012, however, it was claimed that Bailey attacked another sex worker, again in St Kilda.
Like most of his attacks, he took her to a laneway, trapped her, and basically spent a long period threatening her, punching her, and raping her. During the course of the attack, he showed a very distinctive tribal tattoo on his arm, and he told her that he attended the Phoenix Gym in Coburg. He basically gave her a lot of clues as to his identity for her to report to police.
She eventually tries to kick her way out of the car and smashes the windscreen.
At that point, Bailey said, "What have you done? I've only raped you." This, to me, indicates a complete lack of empathy, insight, and clearly desensitised to the process. In other words, these people are depersonalised. He doesn't understand the seriousness of it.
Traumatised, she didn't report it for 2 weeks. She had a history of mental instability. When she subsequently did go to the police, she was drunk and unwell. They didn't take a statement at the time. They ended up sort of committing her for treatment because she was so mentally unwell at the time. This is a pity because it happened 5 months before Jill Meagher was killed.
In July 2012, less than 3 months before the murder of Jill Meagher, Bailey would attack a Dutch backpacker, again in St Kilda.
He had approached the girl by calling her over to his car and telling her that she was being followed. She thought he looked normal enough and heeded his warning and jumped in. He subsequently took her to a laneway where he took most of his victims in that part of Melbourne, trapped her against a wall so she couldn't get out, and basically spent half an hour violently assaulting her. They followed a pattern, these attacks. Sometimes he would cry, sometimes he would apologise, and sometimes he would cry and apologise and then rape them again. Very, very similar in the nature, all of these attacks. She was very clever, told him that, why not go back to my place, it'd be more comfortable there, and was very, very clever in getting away from him. She escaped when she got to the front door and had other housemates there and basically escaped his clutches. The great pity with this one is she provided a remarkable photo fit to police that looks almost identical to Adrian Bailey. Now that photo fit was out and about and on public display weeks before Jill Meagher was attacked and killed, and you've only got to wonder, as some people do, if somebody had recognised Adrian Bailey from that photo fit, would Jill Meagher still be with us today?
In 2015, while in prison for the murder of Jill Meagher, Bailey faced separate trials for each of these attacks.
He pleaded not guilty to all of them and was found guilty on all counts.
Bailey was sentenced to 18 years for the 3 rapes. However, in 2016, he successfully appealed his conviction for the attack on the St Kilda woman in 2000. The Court of Appeal cut his sentence by 3 years, meaning Bailey will be 83 before he can be considered for parole. In the aftermath of Bailey's sentencing, and after much public outcry over similar cases where the offender was released only to go on to commit further crimes, Australians began asking an important question: just how effective was the current parole system?
The purpose of parole is to provide a structured, supported and supervised release for a prisoner to transition back into the community on conditions which are aimed at reducing that prisoner's risk of reoffending and encouraging his rehabilitation. There is always a risk. There must be. With any human being, there is always a risk, and the board cannot eliminate risk. But what the board attempts to do is to minimise risk so as to make it acceptable.
It became immediately apparent when Adrian Bailey was identified that he had slipped through the cracks of the justice system, and it was clear right from the start that people needed answers. They really wanted to know, how did this innocent woman come to be killed by somebody who shouldn't have been on the street? There were all sorts of flags going up all over the place, and as we well know now, he was committing rapes on other victims, and yet he was still able, unfettered by any sort of authorities or any sorts of controls, to do what he did to Jill Meagher.
The Victorian government requested former High Court Justice Ian Callanan, QC, to undertake a review of the parole system and of the parole board. The principal recommendations are these: that 1, the paramount consideration in any decision-making, whether it be to grant parole, vary parole or cancel it, must be the safety and protection of the community. And that's the most important recommendation, I think. The second was that prisoners must take responsibility for applying for parole.
This report draws a line in the sand. The culture of parole in Victoria must and will change.
Adrian Bailey would be the most hated man in jail. Because of him, all parole doesn't happen at its earliest date. You have to apply for it now, and you won't necessarily be given it. You've got to basically earn it.
Another important recommendation was the categorisation of a number of crimes into what are now called violent offences or sex offences. Any prisoner with a history of such crimes would require added scrutiny from the parole board.
That prisoner would need to be assessed in terms of future risk, and if the risk was considered to be moderate or high, that prisoner had to undertake offender behaviour programs if he expected to get released on parole. Adrian Bailey would certainly have fitted into that category.
In such a tragic case as the murder of Jill Meagher, there are few positives. However, the sweeping changes made to the Victorian parole system in the wake of Jill's death serve at least as some meaningful legacy.
I've often referred to the Jill Meagher case as the catalyst for change. A Melbourne journalist, a very prominent one, recently wrote an article about the transformation of the board. And in the context of that transformation, he concluded his article by saying that the changes should be referred to as Jill's Law.
This crime differs significantly from other crimes of this nature. It resonates and identifies the victim. Other cases identified the offender. It goes by offender's name and people can relate to it. This is one of those rare cases that the media and the community resonate with the victim, and that's where we should be.
I think the death of Jill Meagher touched so many people because this sort of thing shouldn't happen in Melbourne. It certainly shouldn't happen anywhere, but Melbourne it considers itself a sort of big community, and it was something that gripped people at the time.
I think everybody related to Jill Meagher because she was a normal person living a normal life and does what we all do on a Friday night, not expecting anything like this could happen. She was only a couple of 100 metres away from home, and she is basically not suspecting a predator to be in her midst, let alone someone with his history.
It was a random attack on a beautiful human being. It shouldn't have happened. The system should have done better by Jill Meagher.